He slammed his fist down so hard the coffee mug shattered. Not cracked, not tipped over, shattered. Hot coffee sprayed across the counter, across Tessa's uniform, across the $7 in singles she'd just finished counting. The man behind that fist-black suit, dead eyes, blood running down his left arm and pooling on her freshly mopped floor, leaned forward until she could smell the rain and iron on him. "You deaf?" he said. Quiet, that was the worst part. He wasn't yelling anymore. I said, "Get me something to wrap this." Now, Tessa Rowan had been threatened before, by landlords with eviction notices, by managers who docked her tips, by drunks who thought 3A. M gave them permission. She'd learned something over 7 years of graveyard shifts at Marlowe's all-night diner. The men who got quiet were always the ones who meant it. She looked at the shattered mug, looked at the blood on her floor, looked at the 2 enormous men standing behind him near the door, one of whom had his hand inside his jacket. Then she picked up the coffee pot. She held it directly over his open wound. "If you yell at me again," she said, "this goes directly into your arm. If you've ever worked a job where someone thought they could talk to you any way they wanted, stay right here. Because what happens next will make you want to stand up and cheer. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city. In the comments below, I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button too, and do not go anywhere, because this is only the beginning. Thing about 3:14 in the mornings is that the city pretends to sleep, but never actually does. Tessa knew this better than most. She'd been working the graveyard shift at Marlowe's all-night diner for so long that she'd stopped thinking of night as night. It was just the other half of the day, louder, in some ways, quieter in others, and populated by a very specific kind of person. Nurses still wearing their scrubs, cab drivers killing time between fares, insomniacs who needed somewhere warm to stare at their phones, the occasional young couple pretending the world belonged to them because no one else was watching. Tessa had learned to read all of them within 30 seconds of the bell above the door. That skill, as it turned out, was worth less than she'd imagined when 3 men walked in from the rain. She heard the door before she saw them, not the soft jingle of the bell, but a hard bang, like someone had thrown their shoulder into it. She looked up from the register she'd been tallying the night's tickets, mostly out of habit, since the machine did it automatically. But her old manager had made her do it by hand, and she'd never fully stopped, and the first thing she registered was the rain. It was coming down hard outside, had been for the past 2 hours. The gutters were overwhelmed, and the streetlight on the corner had given up and gone dark sometime around 1. The second thing she registered was the blood. Not a little blood, not a scrape. The man in the center, tall, dark-haired, wearing a suit that had probably cost more than Tessa's monthly rent before whatever had happened to it tonight, had his left arm pressed tight against his ribs. His jacket was dark enough that you could almost miss the stain spreading from just below his shoulder. But Tessa had spent years developing peripheral vision, sharp enough to catch a customer reaching for the sugar without asking, and she saw it immediately. The 2 men flanking him were bigger. One was broad across the shoulders with a flat, weathered face and close-cropped gray at his temples. The other was younger, maybe mid-20s, with the particular stillness of someone waiting for permission to move. Both of them were scanning the diner before they were fully through the door. There were 3 other customers in the place. An older man nursing decaf at the far end of the counter. A woman in her 40s doing a crossword puzzle in a corner booth. A kid couldn't have been more than 19 asleep, with his head on his arms over a plate of untouched eggs. Nobody looked up. The man in the center walked to the counter and sat down on a stool as though the effort cost him something real. He moved carefully, like a person who had already calculated exactly how much he could do before his body refused to cooperate. He set his right hand flat on the counter. His left arm stayed tucked in against his side. His eyes found Tessa. They were dark eyes, tired, alert in the way that certain kinds of tired made people alert, not the alertness of rest, but of prolonged tension. Like a rubber band that had been stretched so long it had forgotten what slack felt like. "Coffee," he said, "and something to wrap this." Tessa looked at the arm. How bad? Coffee first. She poured the coffee because arguing with a man who'd walked in from the rain bleeding wasn't her first choice for 3:14 on a Wednesday morning. She set the mug in front of him, then turned toward the back where they kept the first aid kit, a battered green box that lived under the counter near the fire extinguisher, and contained approximately 4 bandages, some expired antiseptic spray, and a roll of gauze that she'd bought herself because the owner wouldn't. She brought it back and set it on the counter. He looked at it. Something moved across his face. Not gratitude, not contempt. Something in between. I need actual supplies, he said. That's what I've got. His jaw tightened. This is a diner. You have a kitchen. There are dish towels. There is... He stopped, pressed his arm tighter. I need more than 4 bandages and some gauze. I have dish towels, Tessa said. They're clean. I washed them at the start of the shift. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, fine. Get them. She got them. She set them next to the first aid kit. He reached for his jacket, trying to work it off his injured arm, and the effort made him go pale underneath whatever color remained in his face. She watched him struggle with it for 3 seconds, and then stepped around the counter. Move your hand, she said. He looked at her. What? Your hand. Move it. He moved it. She eased the jacket off his shoulder, carefully seeing the sleeve down his arm, the way she'd learned to do things at jobs that required you to be efficient or get fired. The suit jacket dropped onto the stool beside him. The shirt beneath was white, had been white, with a long-sleeved button cuff, soaked through at the forearm. She looked at the wound through the fabric. Deep, not arterial. He'd have been in far worse shape if it were arterial, but deep enough. A knife, she thought, not a bullet. The shape was wrong for a bullet. When did this happen? Recently. You need a hospital. No, you need stitches, I'm aware. His tone flattened. Are you going to help, or are you going to keep telling me things I already know? Tessa looked at him. She had a policy, developed over years, about men who spoke to her that way. The policy was essentially she did not reward it. She reached for the antiseptic spray, which was expired but probably still functional, and without any particular warning, she pressed the soaked gauze against his wound. He didn't make a sound. He went rigid and white-knuckled on the counter, but he didn't make a sound. She gave him credit for that, silently, and kept working. The 2 other men had positioned themselves near the door and by the far end of the counter. The broad-shouldered one was watching the parking lot through the window. The younger one was watching Tessa with the kind of attention that was meant to be felt. She ignored him. You're going to need actual stitches when this is over, she said. The gauze will slow the bleeding, but it won't hold if you do anything that moves your arm. Understood. Is there someone chasing you? A beat of silence. Why? Because I have 3 other customers in here, and I'd like to know if something is about to come through my windows. He looked at her for a moment with those tired, stretched rubber band eyes. You're not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't a question. There was something in it, not quite surprise. More like recognition, the way you recognize something you'd forgotten existed. I'm not afraid of you, Tessa said. I'm just also tired, and I've got 4 hours left on this shift. One problem at a time. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the possibility of one. She finished, wrapping his forearm with the gauze and one of the dish towels, secured it with the last of the medical tape in the kit, and stepped back to examine her work. It wasn't pretty. It was functional, which in Tessa's experience was the better quality anyway. You need to keep pressure on that, she said. Don't bend the elbow if you can avoid it. He looked down at her work. You've done this before. No, but I've watched enough medical dramas to get by. He looked up at her. This time something warmer moved through his expression, brief as a match struck in wind. And then his phone rang. The change was immediate. The near warmth vanished. His face closed like a door being shut, and the man who'd been almost human for 3 minutes became something else entirely. He looked at the screen, said something low and sharp in a language she didn't recognize to the broad-shouldered man, and that man moved immediately toward the exit to check the lot. He answered the phone. Tessa moved back around the counter and began cleaning up the blood on the surface and the floor because it needed doing, and because she understood that she'd just been dismissed and was okay with that arrangement. She heard him speaking in English now, short sentences, the kind of language that meant everything and communicated nothing to anyone who didn't already know the context. How many, he said, and then, is Renner with them? And then a long silence during which his hand tightened on the counter. Then we don't move until I say. He hung up. He sat for a moment without moving. Then he picked up the coffee mug and drank half of it and set it down and looked at it like he was trying to determine whether it had done him any good. Tessa refilled it without being asked. He looked at her. Thank you, he said, quietly. You're welcome. They stayed like that for a moment, the counter between them, the rain against the windows. The sleeping kid at the booth and the crossword woman and the decaf man all existing in that particular bubble, that night shift workers inhabited at this hour. That place where the normal world's rules didn't quite apply. My name is Roman, he said, not offering it, just placing it there. Tessa. He said it once, like he was deciding whether it matched her. Have you worked here long? 7 years. Do you own it? No. The word came out flatter than she intended. I do not own it. He nodded, said nothing further. Drank his coffee. An hour passed, in which he did nothing she could object to. He spread some papers across the counter. She didn't look at them and read them. With the focused attention of someone who was used to doing important things in inconvenient circumstances. The broad-shouldered man came back inside. The younger one remained near the door. No one came through the windows. Around 4:30, the sleeping kid woke up, looked at his plate of eggs in apparent confusion, left a $5 bill on the table, and wandered out. The crossword woman finished whatever was giving her trouble and left shortly after. The decaf man had a second cup and then a third. Roman folded his papers around 5. He stood carefully. He reached into his jacket pocket. Tessa watched both his men tense slightly, not at him but reflexively, the way you get when someone you're responsible for moves, and pulled out his wallet. He placed $500 beneath the coffee mug. Tessa looked at it. That's too much, she said. Keep it. There's a word for what you're trying to do. He looked at her steadily. The word is paying for services rendered. You wrapped my arm. You didn't call the police. You didn't ask questions I'd have had to lie about. A pause. I find that kind of discretion worth compensating. Tessa looked at the money. She looked at him. She thought about the electric bill that was 3 weeks overdue and the shoe on her right foot that had a hole in the sole she'd been plugging with a folded paper towel. She left the money where it was. The gauze needs to be changed in 4 to 6 hours, she said. Don't get it wet. He nodded once. He and his 2 men walked out into what had become a diminished rain, somewhere between storm and drizzle, and the bell above the door rang its normal gentle ring. And Tessa stood behind her counter in a diner that smelled like coffee and old grease and the particular mineral sharpness of blood that she'd cleaned but not entirely erased, and she looked at the $500 and thought, that's never going to happen again. She was wrong, of course. She was spectacularly, completely, life-alteringly wrong. Tessa didn't sleep well that day. This wasn't unusual. She slept badly most days, her schedule permanently inverted by 7 years of nights, her body convinced that real rest was something that happened to other people, but the quality of her wakefulness had changed. She lay in her apartment, which was small and cold, because the building's heat ran on a schedule that didn't account for people who needed warmth during daylight hours, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about a man named Roman. She thought about his hands, the right one, which had been controlled and deliberate, and the left one, which she'd wrapped in dish towel and gauze. She thought about the way his face had closed when his phone rang. She thought about the word discretion and the particular way he'd used it, as though it were a commodity he'd priced out and was offering to pay for at fair market value. She thought, what kind of man shows up bleeding at 3 a.m. and tips $500 and says thank you like he means it? The answer, she suspected, was not a good kind of man. She fell asleep eventually and dreamed about nothing she remembered and woke up at 11 p. and made herself eat something and put on her uniform and walk to work in the cold because the bus at this hour was unreliable, and she'd learned not to depend on it. Marlowe's was mostly empty when she arrived. It was always mostly empty this early in the shift. The night crowd not yet thinned out from whatever they'd been doing with their evenings. Her coworker, a man named Dennis, who was 62 years old and had been working the diner longer than Tessa, had been alive and treated every customer interaction as a mild personal inconvenience. Handed her the apron without looking up from his phone. "Quiet night," he said. "Good," she said. It stayed quiet until just after midnight when the door opened and Roman walked in. Alone this time, he was wearing different clothes. Dark jacket, no suit, the kind of deliberately nondescript outfit that somehow still managed to look expensive. His left arm was in a clean bandage, proper medical gauze, she noticed, taped properly, which meant he'd eventually found someone with real supplies, and he moved with slightly more ease than the night before. The wound wasn't slowing him down the way it had been. He sat on the same stool. Tessa looked at him. He looked at her. "Coffee," he said. "You know where the door is," she said. "In case there's some confusion about that, I do." He paused. "I'd like coffee, please, and to talk to you about something, if you'll allow it." Dennis was at the other end of the counter, pretending not to be curious. There were two couples in booths, and a man at the far end who was clearly a regular and never acknowledged anything happening around him unless it directly impacted his ability to eat his pie in peace. Tessa poured the coffee. She set it in front of him and crossed her arms and waited. "I need somewhere to work," Roman said. "Somewhere my enemies wouldn't expect. Somewhere I can sit without my back to a door and think without being interrupted." Tessa glanced at the door which Roman had, she noticed, positioned himself so that he could see without turning his head, and then back at him. "This is a diner," she said. "Yes. We don't have private meeting rooms." "I don't need a private room. I need a stool." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "I need to be somewhere that no one who wants me dead would think to look. And I've found, in my experience, that people with nothing to hide rarely look in places like this." Tessa stared at him for a long moment. "You want to use my diner as a hideout? I want to pay for a stool and coffee every night. What I use the stool for is my business. And if your business comes through the windows," something tightened in his expression, "it won't. You said that last night too." Then two men with guns walked in. Pause. Something genuine moved through his face, not quite shame. More like the acknowledgement of a fair point being made by someone who had earned the right to make it. $500, he said. "Every night. For the stool and the coffee and your discretion." Tessa thought about the electric bill. She thought about the shoe with the hole. She thought about her landlord who had sent her the third notice in 4 months last Tuesday with a yellow post-it note that said final in handwriting that was somehow both triumphant and cheerful. She thought about what kind of person said yes to this. And then she thought about what kind of person she'd been for 7 years, and whether those two people were necessarily different. "My rules," she said. Roman tilted his head slightly. "Waiting. No violence in my diner. No shouting. No threatening my customers or my coworkers. If trouble follows you here, real trouble, not the kind that goes away when you look at it. Hard you tell me before it arrives, not after." She paused. "And the coffee pot threat is permanent and unconditional." Something happened to his face. It was the closest she'd seen to a real smile, not the near smile from the night before, but something that actually reached his eyes, however briefly. "Agreed," he said. "One more thing. Yes, you drink the coffee while it's hot. I'm not reheating it." The smile, if that was what it was, deepened. "Understood." She left him there with his coffee and went to take an order from the couple in the corner booth, and she didn't let herself think too hard about what she'd just agreed to, because she'd found them thinking about decisions made at midnight in a diner that smelled like old grease was rarely useful. What she did let herself notice, though, was that when she came back behind the counter, 40 minutes later, Roman had papers spread across the area beside his mug, and he was reading them with complete focus, and his back was to nobody, and he had not shouted at anyone, and the coffee was already gone. She refilled it. He didn't thank her, but he noticed. She could see that he noticed, and somehow that felt like enough. The nights that followed had a rhythm that Tessa hadn't anticipated. She had expected awkwardness, or tension, or the kind of awareness that made ordinary tasks feel performed. What she got instead was something stranger, a silence that wasn't quite silent. Roman arrived between midnight and 1 every night. He sat on the same stool. He spread his papers. He drank his coffee. He made and received phone calls in the brief quiet stretches between customers, always stepping toward the far end of the counter to speak at a volume too low to make out, which was a courtesy she hadn't expected and noticed more than she'd intended. He didn't explain what he was doing. She didn't ask. What she did, because she was Tessa, and she'd spent 7 years reading people across a counter, was observe. She observed that he never ordered food until the third night, and then it was only pie cherry, which she'd have assumed was too sweet for a man who took his coffee black, but people were consistently unpredictable in the small details. She observed that he checked his watch frequently, but always at specific intervals, like he was measuring something. She observed that his papers were sometimes covered in numbers, and sometimes in dense text, and occasionally in what looked like maps or diagrams that he folded quickly whenever she refilled his coffee, not in a way that felt hostile, just in a way that suggested he'd just made a careful distinction between discretion she'd agreed to provide and information she'd actually seen. She respected the distinction. She made no effort to see what she wasn't meant to see. What she saw anyway, because it was unavoidable, was him. The suit that was always impeccable, but sometimes showed, if you looked carefully, the evidence of being lived in for too many consecutive hours. The way he rubbed the space between his eyes when he was reading something that frustrated him. The slight change in the set of his shoulders when a call went badly versus when it went the way he'd needed it to. He was running some large and complicated and under-sustained threat, and he was doing it with a particular kind of exhaustion that came from doing it without enough sleep for too long. None of this was her business. She knew that. She knew it particularly clearly on the 9th night when he sat down and she set his coffee in front of him, and he looked at it for a long moment before drinking, and she realized that the circles under his eyes had deepened to something almost alarming. "When did you last sleep?" she said. He looked up. "Don't. I'm not asking as anything except someone who's watched you drink approximately 40 cups of coffee in 9 days. I'm pointing out that the caffeine is doing less work than you think it is." A long pause. 3 hours last night. And the night before? Tessa. Roughly. Something like reluctance crossed his face. 4, maybe. That's not sustainable, I'm aware. His jaw set. "I don't have the option. I know," she said. "I'm not telling you to fix it. I'm telling you it's happening, in case nobody else around you is saying it." He looked at her with the kind of attention that made her suddenly aware of how little space there was on the other side of a diner counter. "They're not," he said. Quiet. Saying it. "Well." She picked up a rag and wiped a part of the counter that didn't need wiping. "Consider yourself told." He drank his coffee. She moved away to take care of other customers, and when she came back, he had his paper out and was working again, and nothing had been resolved, and nothing had been promised. But something had shifted in the atmosphere between them that she couldn't quite name and didn't try to. It kept shifting in small ways across the nights that followed. She noticed the boots before he said anything about them. They appeared in the break room new, waterproof, expensive, exactly her size in a plain paper bag with no note. She stood in front of them for a full 30 seconds, trying to decide how to feel about that, and then she put them on, because her old ones leaked and the winter was getting serious. She didn't mention them to him. He didn't mention them either. But when she came out from the back wearing them, she caught him looking at her feet for exactly 2 seconds before he looked back at his papers, and she thought, "You ridiculous man." The space heater appeared 3 nights later, the tea imported, in a box she'd never seen before, but that turned out to be exactly the kind she'd have bought for herself if she could afford. It appeared the night after that. She thought about what to do about all of it. She decided the honest answer was, drink the tea, appreciate the warmth, and acknowledge to herself that she was in a situation she hadn't fully planned for and couldn't entirely regret. What she hadn't planned for, specifically, was the way he looked at her when she said something unexpected. The first few times she'd pushed back on him the coffee pot threat The rules she'd laid down she'd expected irritation, or the kind of dismissal that men with power reserved for people they'd decided didn't matter. What she got instead was attention, real attention. The kind that made you aware that you were being actually listened to, not just heard. She was not accustomed to that. She found, to her own significant annoyance, that she was not immune to it. The night she realized she was in real trouble was the night the drunk man grabbed her wrist. It happened quickly, the way those things always did. A man who'd been in 3 of the past 4 booths for the last 2 hours, ordering coffee and refills and nursing, something he'd brought in himself from the flask in his jacket pocket, reached across the counter when she was refilling his mug and grabbed her wrist with both hands. "Hey," he said. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Look at me." She'd handled this before. She turned toward him calmly. "Let go of my arm. I've been sitting here for 2 hours, and you haven't. Let go of my arm right now." He tightened his grip. His eyes were bleary and red-edged, and she could see he was past the point where reason was particularly effective. She was already shifting her weight, already calculating how to get free without escalating further, when she became aware that the quality of the room had changed. It took her a half-second to identify why. Roman was standing directly behind the man. He hadn't made a noise. He hadn't announced himself. He was just there, and the man seemed to become aware of this, the way animals become aware of something larger in their vicinity, not through sight or sound, but through some instinct that evolved specifically for this kind of situation. Roman didn't grab the man. He didn't threaten him. He reached around him and placed 2 fingers on the man's wrist, the hand that was holding Tessa, and applied pressure to a specific point with a precision that made the man's grip loosen involuntarily. Then he leaned down and said something very quietly near the man's ear. She couldn't hear what it was. She could see the man's face, though. She could see what happened to it. Whatever Roman had said, it was sufficient. The man left. He left his jacket. He left money on the table. He left fast. Roman stood up straight. He looked at Tessa. "You're fine," he said. Not a performance of concern. Question. Yes, she flexed her wrist. It was fine. What did you say to him? Nothing worth repeating. Roman. He looked at her steadily. I told him that touching you would be the last voluntary action he'd ever take, and that I was going to give him 30 seconds to make a better decision. A pause. He made a better decision. Tessa looked at him. She thought about several different things simultaneously. She thought about the fact that she should probably be upset about the implicit violence in that statement. She thought about the fact that she was not upset. She thought about the fact that she was not upset, which was itself upsetting. "Thank you," she said. Roman nodded. He went back to his stool. He picked up his coffee. His hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. She noticed that he noticed that she'd noticed, and that he set the mug down and looked at his papers instead. Tessa went to the far end of the counter and pretended to check the sugar dispensers and gave him time to reassemble whatever had just briefly come apart, because it seemed like the decent thing to do. Later, much later, after the diner had mostly emptied and the 5A, quiet had settled in like something physical. She was wiping tables when she stopped and let herself understand something she'd been working around for days. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Not in the practical, self-protective sense that she'd been afraid of him on the first night, the kind of fear that sharpened your attention and made you functional. What she felt now was something entirely different and considerably more complicated. She was going to be in a great deal of trouble. She already knew it. She picked up her rag and went back to work. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which was fitting, because Tessa had always hated Tuesdays. She'd told Roman that once, offhand, around the 3rd week of their arrangement, and he'd looked at her with that particular attention and asked why, and she'd said because Tuesday was the day after the weekend, which meant it was the moment when the illusion that things might get better had fully expired for another week, and he'd been quiet for a long moment and then said, "I've never thought about days of the week that way." And she'd said, "That's because you've never worked a job where the weekend meant something." And he hadn't had an answer for that, and she'd moved away to take an order, and she'd thought about it afterward, the way she thought about most of their exchanges, not obsessively. but with the particular attention you gave to something that hadn't resolved itself cleanly. Tuesday the trouble started was the 23rd day of their arrangement. She knew the number because she'd been keeping track in the small notebook she used for order calculations, not in a way she was particularly proud of, just a small tally in the back margin. The kind of thing you did when you were trying to keep an honest account of your own life. 23 days. 23 nights of coffee and papers and silence that had gradually become something else. 23 evenings of watching Roman carry whatever he carried into her diner and set it down briefly, the way a man sets down a heavy bag when he finds somewhere he's allowed to rest. She'd almost gotten used to it. That was the problem. Roman arrived that night later than usual, nearly 2 in the morning, which was an hour past his normal window, and when he came through the door, he didn't take the stool immediately. He stood near the entrance for a moment, not frozen, not afraid, but thinking. The way you stood in a doorway when the room you were about to enter required something from you that you hadn't yet decided to give. Tessa was behind the counter. She watched him and said nothing, and poured his coffee and set it on the counter and waited. He sat down eventually. He didn't reach for the coffee immediately. He sat with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes on the middle distance, and she'd learned by now that this particular stillness meant something had gone wrong, in a specific way, not the rolling, managed wrongness of his daily operations, but something with an edge. "You going to tell me?" she said. "No." "Okay." She moved away, gave him the room. He lasted 4 minutes before he said, "One of my people is talking to someone they shouldn't be." Tessa came back to the counter. She leaned against it. "Someone on your side?" "Yes." "Talking to who?" He picked up his coffee finally. Drank. Set it down. "A man named Silas Merrick. He runs one of the operation branches. He's been building something for about 6 months, from what I can piece together. Taking people, resources, loyalty, working the edges where it's hardest to see." Tessa thought about this. "You knew about him before tonight." "I suspected." "What changed tonight?" Roman was quiet for a beat too long. "I had a meeting that 2 people knew about. The location. The time. When I arrived, the location had been watched. Not visited, watched. Someone positioned in advance to confirm I'd be there." He turned the mugs slightly with his right hand, a small precise rotation. "That's not surveillance of opportunity. That's surveillance of information. A leak. A deliberate one. How many people knew the meeting location?" He looked at her. 4. Tessa let that sit. "And you trust all 4? "I trusted all 4. Past tense, slight but clear." She refilled his coffee without being asked, and didn't comment on the tense, because she understood the distance between trusting someone yesterday and trusting them tonight, and how fast that distance could open. "What are you going to do?" she said. "What I always do." He picked up the mug. "Figure it out before it figures me out first." That's not really an answer. "No." He drank. "It's not." She left him to his papers. But she carried the conversation with her through the next 2 hours of the shift, refilling and clearing and making change. And she turned the number 4 over in her mind the way you turned a stone over when you suspected something was living under it. She was still thinking about it at 4 a.m. when Brock Serrano walked in. She'd seen Brock before. He was the broad-shouldered man who'd come in with Roman the first night, the one who'd watched the parking lot with that professional, tireless attention. He'd been in the diner maybe a dozen times since then, always briefly, always delivering or collecting something from Roman before positioning himself near the door. He didn't position himself near the door tonight. He came directly to the counter. He sat 2 stools down from Roman. He ordered coffee from Tessa, first time he'd ever ordered anything, and then looked at Roman and said, quietly and without preamble, "Reyes didn't come back from the drop." Roman set his pen down when? 3 hours ago. He was supposed to check in at 1. Nothing since. Reyes knows the protocol. Yes, Brock's voice was level, the kind of level that took practice. He does. Roman and Brock looked at each other for a moment, in the way that men who'd worked together for a long time communicated, the compression of a longer conversation into a shared glance that covered the essentials. "Pull the others in," Roman said. "Not the facility. Use the Clement Street location. Already started." Roman nodded. He gathered his papers efficiently, not rushed. The movements of someone who'd folded up and moved quickly before and knew the difference between necessary speed and panic. He stood. He looked at Tessa. "I may not be in tomorrow night," he said. "Okay. If anyone comes here asking about me." "I don't know any Roman," she said. "Never heard of him. Strange man occasionally sits at my counter and drinks coffee, but I don't ask names." Something crossed his face. "Tessa, go," she said. "Do what you have to do." He held her eyes for one more second. Then he and Brock went out into the dark, and the door swung shut, and the bell rang, and Tessa stood behind her counter and listened to the rain starting again outside and thought, 23 days. He was back in 2 nights. He looked like he'd slept maybe 4 of the intervening 48 hours. There was a tension around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The specific tightness of someone who had been managing a crisis that kept evolving faster than their solutions could land. He sat down. She poured the coffee. She didn't ask. He told her anyway, eventually, which was also new the telling. "Reyes turned up," he said, "alive. He made a mistake, not a betrayal. Wrong channel at the wrong time. Cost me 2 nights of thinking I had a bigger problem than I did." "But you still have the problem you had." "Yes," he turned the mug. "The 4 people who knew my meeting location. I've run everything I can run on each of them. 3 are clean, as far as I can see. The 4th," he stopped. "The 4th what?" "Has a brother with debt problems. Significant debt. The kind of number that makes people make choices they wouldn't otherwise make." Tessa thought about debt. She thought about the 3 notices on her table. She thought about the way fear of a number on paper could rewrite everything you believed about yourself. "That doesn't make him guilty," she said. "No." Roman looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. "You're right, it doesn't." He paused. "Most people assume it does. Most people haven't been broke." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right about that, too." She moved away. Came back. The night stretched on around them, the diner cycling through its 3A. Population of the stranded and the sleepless and the shift workers, and Roman worked at his papers, and Tessa worked at her counter. And the rhythm between them reasserted itself, like something physical, the way a room's temperature reasserts itself after you open a window. It was almost comfortable, which was exactly when Silas Merrick's men walked in. There were 2 of them. They came in at 3:47, and Tessa knew immediately they were wrong. Not wrong the way the drunk man had been wrong, or wrong the way bad night customers were wrong. Wrong the way that Roman on the first night had been wrong, a specific, precise wrongness. The wrongness of people who moved through the world, expecting it to accommodate them by force of what they were prepared to do. They sat in the booth nearest the door, both of them, side by side facing the room, which was the kind of seating choice that had nothing to do with. Roman was at the counter with his back to them, but she watched Haas' posture change in the 3 seconds after the bell rang. Subtle. A slight realignment of his shoulders. He didn't turn around. She went to take their order. They ordered coffee. One of them taller, with a jaw like a shelf and a scar that ran from his left ear toward his chin, watched her with the kind of attention that was meant to feel like a hand around her throat. She wrote down the order. She went back to the counter. She poured the coffees. Roman said very quietly, not looking at her. They came in together. "Yes," and sat facing the room. "Yes. Is there a back exit you can use without going past them?" Her chest tightened. "The kitchen has a loading door." "Where does it open?" "Alley. Runs to 2nd Street." "Good." He still hadn't moved. "Take your phone. Go tell your coworker there's a—" "Dennis went home at 3, she said. "It's just me." A beat of silence. She could see in her peripheral vision the slight change in Roman's jaw. "Go to the kitchen," he said. "Now. I'm not going to—" "Tessa." He said it low and clear, and with an edge she'd never heard in his voice before, not anger, which she'd have pushed back against, but something more fundamental. Something that sounded like fear wearing a controlled face. "Please." She'd gotten halfway around the counter when the taller one stood up. "Hey," he said, "Waitress, we need to talk." She stopped. She turned. He was standing now, and the other one shorter, darker, with a stillness that she recognized as the worst kind, was still seated, but had angled himself toward the room. I'm getting your coffees, she said. We don't need the coffees. The tall one moved toward the counter. We need to know where he is. He said it looking at the door, at the room, not at Roman's back, which meant he didn't know, which meant they'd come here looking, not following. Where who is, Tessa said. Don't. He stopped 3 feet from her. You've been seen. You've been noted. We know he's been coming here. So, either you tell me where Roman Vare is right now, or we take you somewhere and ask you again where the acoustics are better. Everything in Tessa's body went cold and sharp at once. She didn't look at Roman. She kept her eyes on the tall man. I don't know anyone by that name, she said. The man reached across the counter and grabbed the front of her uniform. He didn't yank her forward. He just gripped it. A demonstration. A preview. Try again, he said. And then Roman stood up. He didn't rush. He stood up from the stool the way he'd sat down on it, with the complete physical controls of someone who'd made a decision and was executing it without internal argument. He turned around. He looked at the tall man. He looked at his hand on Tessa's uniform. Let go, Roman said. His voice was absolutely level. Not loud. Not theatrical. The kind of level that had nothing to perform and nothing to prove. The tall man's head turned. When he saw Roman, something moved across his face recognition, then a rapid recalculation, then the decision about which direction to take that recalculation. He took the wrong direction. There he is, he said, and he let go of Tessa's uniform and reached inside his jacket. What happened in the next 6 seconds was something Tessa would not be able to fully reassemble afterward in the right order. She knew that Roman moved. She knew the stool went over. She knew there was a sound, not a gunshot, not yet that was something hitting, something with significant force. She knew the shorter man was on his feet and moving, and then was not moving, because Brock Serrano came through the front door, like he'd been standing right outside it waiting, which he probably had been. And the shorter man's arm was bent the wrong way, and he was on his knees. The tall man was on the floor. Roman was standing over him with one knee and one hand, and the man's jacket twisted in a grip that kept him exactly as still as Roman wanted him to be. Silas sent you, Roman said. Still that same level. Who else knows you're here? The man said nothing. Roman's grip tightened. I'm going to ask you one more time. It doesn't matter, the man said through a jaw that wasn't working perfectly. He knows where to find her now, whether I tell him or not. The air went out of the room. Tessa heard it, heard the way the sentence landed in Roman's body, the slight change in his breathing, the second of absolute stillness that preceded a different kind of action. Then he looked at her, and she saw it again, that thing she'd seen, the night of the drunk man's hand on her wrist. Except now it was bigger. Now it was unmistakable because it had a concrete cause and a concrete consequence, and Roman understood exactly what both of them were. She'd been seen. She'd been noted. She'd been filed away as the thing that could be used. She'd become a target before she'd ever agreed to be anything at all. Glass exploded inward from the front window. Not a bullet, a brick. And behind it, through the gaping frame, came the sound of shouting in the street and the specific, sharp report of a firearm from somewhere too close. Brock moved immediately, pushing the shorter man down and toward the door in the same motion, his own weapon drawn. And Roman pulled Tessa bodily off her feet, and behind the counter as a second shot punched through the window frame and buried itself in the wall behind where she'd been standing. She was on the floor behind the counter. Roman was beside her. His arm was around her, not romantic, not careful, the specific grip of someone making sure a person they were responsible for didn't move in the wrong direction. He had his phone in his other hand already and was talking, fast and low, second entry, second and Marlowe. Get everyone here now, more glass. The sound of Brock's gun from the direction of the door. Tessa's hands were completely steady, which surprised her, and her brain was running at a speed she hadn't known it could operate at. Tracking sounds and angles and distances with the instinct of someone who'd spent years managing chaos on a smaller scale. She pressed her back against the counter cabinet. She looked at Roman. How many, she said. I don't know. Estimate. He looked at her sharply. 4 outside, minimum. Possibly more staged down the block. Brock? He can hold the door for a few minutes. Your people how far? 8 minutes, maybe 10. She ran the numbers. She looked at the counter above her, the shelf where the coffee pot lived, the reach-through window to the kitchen, the position of the door versus the broken window versus the angle of what she'd heard. The window shot came from the right, she said. Across the street. The door is on the left. If they're trying to drive you toward the door. They're not, Roman said. They want to box me in. Pin position? Wait for the main group. Then Brock is buying time, not defending. Roman looked at her with that look, the one where she said something he hadn't expected, and he paid attention. Yes. How long before the main group arrives? If they staged nearby, his jaw tightened. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. She heard Brock shout something short and profane, and a third shot came from outside, and she did the math on 3 minutes versus 8, and it was not comfortable math. Kitchen, she said, loading door to the alley. Tessa. The alley runs to second, like I said, but it also runs behind the laundromat to Clement, which comes out above their position. If Brock can keep the door, and they're watching the window, she stopped. I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm telling you what I know about this block. Roman stared at her for 2 full seconds. Then he got on his phone again. The next 3 minutes were the longest Tessa had spent in her life, and she'd had some long ones. She stayed flat against the cabinet. She listened to Roman directing things. She couldn't fully follow through walls and darkness. She listened to Brock, who was doing something very efficient and very dangerous at the front of the diner, and doing it with a concentration that she found, under the circumstances, genuinely impressive. When the sirens started, it was Roman's people who'd called them not to arrive, but as cover, because 2 police cars rolling down 2nd Street made Silas's exterior team scatter and reposition, which opened a window. Brock took the tall man. Roman took Tessa's arm. They went through the kitchen and out the loading door and into the cold of the alley, and Tessa's boots, the waterproof ones Roman had left, without a note held firm on the wet concrete, and she thought, distantly and absurdly, about that. They moved fast, she kept up. She didn't ask where they were going, and he didn't explain, just kept his hand on her arm, not tight, not dragging, the grip of someone who needed to know where she was in the dark. Behind them, she heard shouting from the direction of Marlowe's. She didn't look back. She looked forward, at the alley, at the dark mouth of 2nd Street opening ahead, and she ran. They reached the waterfront in 15 minutes. A logistics building, low and wide, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence that opened via a code, Brock punched in without stopping. Tessa had never been here. She'd had no reason to come here. She didn't have a clear picture of what Roman's operation looked like from the inside, and the abstract knowledge that it was large and organized and involved, people prepared to do serious things, was very different from walking into a building full of armed men who moved in coordinated patterns and spoke in shorthand she didn't know. She stood just inside the door and took it in. It was a working building. Not a lair, not a compound out of a movie, a real functional space with equipment and monitors and crates and people who looked tired, the way workers looked tired, not dramatic. The menace of it was in the competence, the efficiency. Everyone moved like they knew what they were supposed to be doing, and most of them did. Roman kept her close. He spoke to people as he walked, and they responded and adjusted. And she watched him and understood that whatever he was when he sat on the stool at her counter, the tired man with his papers and his 3 hours of sleep was only one version of what he was. This was another version. This was the version that had made people afraid of his name. He brought her to a back office. Small, a desk with monitors showing exterior feeds, a chair. Sit down, he said. I'm not in shock, I know. He looked at her. Sit down anyway. She sat down. He stayed standing, and for a moment the room was quiet in a way that felt almost violent after the noise of the last hour. You're safe here, he said. I know. Tessa. He crossed to her. He crouched in front of the chair so he was at her level, which was a thing she hadn't expected, and looked at her with complete directness. I'm sorry. What happened tonight bringing him into your diner, making it a known location, making you a known face that's on me? All of it. She looked at him. She was aware that she was shaking slightly, which she resented because she'd held herself together through the whole thing and was annoyed that her body was choosing now to register the aftermath. You didn't make me anything, she said. I made the agreement. You made an agreement for a stool and $500 a night. You didn't agree to Roman. She said his name, the way he sometimes said hers flat, precise, stopping the trajectory of what he was about to say. Don't do that. Don't minimize what I agreed to by deciding it was too small a thing for me to have understood. I'm not an idiot. I knew who you were. He held her gaze. Said nothing. I knew, she said quieter. I chose anyway. That's mine. He was still crouching in front of her, and there was a quality to his stillness that she'd learned to read by now, the kind that meant something was moving through him that he hadn't yet decided what to do with. You're the only person in my life, he said slowly, who has never asked me for anything except to be left alone when I yell. The coffee pot request. Yes. Something moved in his expression, tired and sharp, and almost tender. 3 things that shouldn't have coexisted but did, on his face. At this hour, in this room full of surveillance monitors and the distant sounds of his people working. The coffee pot request. She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the exhaustion that lived permanently behind his eyes, and the specific tension in his jaw that appeared when he was controlling something he'd prefer to express, and the small scar at the edge of his chin that she'd noticed around day 12 and never mentioned. What happens next? She said. I end this. Silas won't have enough people to try again after tonight. He overextended. He stood up. It'll be over before morning. And then he looked at her for a long moment. You should take the money I have here and go somewhere safe. Leave the city for a few weeks. Let this settle. Tessa stood up too. She was aware, as she did it, that something in her had already made a decision she hadn't consciously reached yet, and standing up was part of it. No, she said. Tessa, I'm not running from something I chose. She said it simply, no heat in it, just the statement. You do what you have to do tonight. I'll be here when you get back. He looked at her for a very long time. Long enough that she could hear from somewhere in the building the sound of vehicles moving and men coordinating, and the particular controlled urgency of something being organized toward a violent conclusion. Then he stepped forward and he touched her face, his right hand, the controlled one, flat against her cheek, and he looked at her with an expression that she had no name for. Something unguarded and complicated and weighted with more history than she had context for. I need you to understand something, he said. Okay. Everything I've let myself want, he said, has been used against me. Every single thing. Since I was 19 years old, he held her gaze. You've become something I want, which means I know what it means, she said. Tessa, she reached up and put her hand over his. The one on her face. She held it there. I know, she said again. Do you want me to tell you it's fine? Because I can't. It might not be fine, but I'm also not leaving. She paused. Go, come back. Something broke open in his face briefly. He closed it again. Carefully wait, you closed something you intended to return to. He kissed her, not long, not perfectly. It was the kind of kiss that happened between 2 people who hadn't slept enough and were scared and were choosing something anyway, which meant it was honest and a little desperate, exactly what it was. He pulled back. He looked at her. I'll bring coffee, he said. She almost laughed. That's not funny, no. His mouth shifted. But I'll bring it anyway. He went out the door. She heard him talking to Brock immediately on the other side of it, the shift back into operational language, the version of himself that ran things and made decisions and scared people. She sat back down in the chair in front of the monitors. She looked at the screens, exterior feeds, multiple angles. She could see vehicles on one of them, could see figures moving. She had no plan. She had no role here. She was a 30-year-old waitress in a room full of organized criminals, and she had absolutely no reason to think she had anything to contribute to whatever came next. She looked at the monitors. She pulled the chair closer to the desk. And she began to. She pulled the chair closer to the desk and looked at the monitors. There were 9 screens arranged in a 3x3 grid, each one cycling between exterior angles: the fence line, the loading dock, the street approach from the north, the alley behind the building. 2 angles on the waterfront itself, where the black water moved in slow, indifferent patterns. The feeds were sharp. Better than the diner's single grainy camera that pointed at the register and had never actually helped with anything. Tessa sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the screens, and she listened to the building around her. Voices in the corridor, boots on concrete, the specific organized noise of people moving toward a purpose. Roman had been gone 4 minutes. She knew this because she was counting. Not obsessively just tracking the way she tracked table turnover and order times and the slow rotation of a breakfast rush, because tracking was the thing her brain did when it needed something to do with itself. 4 minutes. Somewhere out there, Roman and Brock, and however many men trusted enough to bring on a night like this, were moving toward a warehouse on the south side of the city where Silas Merrick had positioned his people and was waiting. She understood, with the specific clarity that fear sometimes produced, that Roman might not come back. She sat with that understanding for a moment. Examined it the way you examined a bill. You couldn't pay not with panic, because panic didn't help the number, but with the steady, tired recognition that the situation was what it was, and the question was only what you did next. She looked at the monitors, and she began to watch. The man who'd been left to oversee the facility was named Carver. He was compact and quiet, with close-cropped hair going gray at the sides, and the particular efficiency of someone who'd been doing operational work long enough that it had stopped requiring thought and started requiring only attention. He came to check on Tessa twice in the first hour, both times standing in the office doorway with arms crossed and looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. The third time he came, she said, "What's the status?" He looked at her. "Ma'am, you don't need to. I'm not asking you to brief me on confidential information. I'm asking if there's a status update." She kept her eyes on the monitors. Roman said 8 to 10 minutes for his people to reach the warehouse. It's been 63 minutes. That's either going very well or very badly, and I'd like to know which. Carver was quiet for a moment. Communications went down about 45 minutes ago. Tessa's hands were still in her lap. She didn't move them. Down how? Jammed. Someone is running interference on the frequency. Silas. Most likely. So you don't know what's happening? No, ma'am. She looked at the monitors, looked at the waterfront feed, the black water, the stillness of it. Are there cameras near the warehouse? Not ours. City cameras? Traffic systems? Carver's expression shifted slightly. We have access to some of those. Yes. Pull them up. He didn't move immediately. She could feel him assessing her what she was, what she had authority to ask for, where she existed in the structure of Roman Veer's world, which was a question she couldn't have answered herself with any precision. Mr. Veer left instructions that you were to be kept safe and comfortable, Carver said. Then keeping me informed would help with the comfortable part. She looked at him now. Pull up the city cameras near the south side warehouse. Please. He pulled up the cameras. The warehouse complex on the south side of the city was a cluster of 3 connected structures that had been built in the 1970s for industrial storage and had changed hands often enough that nobody entirely kept track of what moved through them. Roman had used the peripheral buildings for legitimate logistics. The central warehouse, the one with the loading bays and the elevated interior walkways and the east-facing freight doors, was where Silas had positioned his people. Tessa could see it on the city traffic camera. Indirectly, the camera was angled for the intersection 2 blocks north, which meant she was seeing the approach road and one corner of the complex's exterior. But she could see vehicles. She could see that there were more vehicles than there should have been parked along the service road. She could see, on the south feed, that Carver pulled from a different city camera that the lights inside the warehouse complex were off. All of them. Complete darkness. The lights were on when Roman left, she said. We believe so, yes. Someone killed them. Yes. Tessa stared at the dark feed. She thought about walking into a building you couldn't see. She thought about Silas knowing where Roman was going and why. How many people did Roman take with him, she said. Carver hesitated. 14, and Silas? A longer hesitation. Our last count suggested he had consolidated roughly 30. Maybe more. 30 versus 14, in the dark, with communications jammed and no way for anyone here to know what was happening. or send anything useful. Tessa did the math, and the math was not survivable, and she sat with that knowledge in her chest and breathed through it and looked at the cameras. She looked at the intersection feed, at the service road, at the vehicles. She counted them. She thought about where you positioned vehicles if you were boxing someone in, versus if you were staging for an assault, versus if you were providing cover for a retreat. She thought about the patterns of diner rushes, where the congestion formed, which tables backed up, which side of the room moved, and which side stalled, and she transposed that thinking onto the edge in front of her. The vehicles on the north approach were spread wide. Too wide for a cordon. They were positioned for she thought about it. They were positioned to manage traffic, to funnel people, away from the north, which meant toward the south. She looked at the south feed. There was a structure she almost missed, a low concrete barrier running along the right side of the south approach. Not a wall, a drainage feature, a trench, maybe 4 feet deep, that ran the length of the building's right flank. She leaned closer to the monitor. "What is that?" she said. On the south feed, the concrete structure running along the building. Carver leaned in. Drainage trench. Old storm system. It runs about 80 yards along the east wall. How deep? 4 feet maybe. 5. Covered? No, open. Tessa's pulse was doing something she was trying not to pay attention to. If someone were coming from the south, from Roman's last position, and they needed to get close to the building without being seen from the loading bay windows, the trench would be cover, Carver said. He was looking at her now with a different quality of attention. And those vehicles on the north side, she pointed at the feed. They're not blocking. They're directing. Pushing anyone coming in from the north toward where? What's on the south end? Carver was quiet for 3 seconds. The transformer station. She looked at him. For the complex, he said. Old industrial setup. It feeds the whole block. He paused. If someone took that out. Everything goes dark, Tessa said. For the whole complex. Including Silas's people. She looked at the monitors. At the trench. At the transformer. At the vehicles positioned to push Roman's men away from every direction except the one that led to both. Can you reach Brock? She said. Any channel. Any frequency they haven't jammed. We've been try a different way. She turned to look at Carver fully. Is there anyone physically close enough to the warehouse to pass a message? A runner. A driver. Anyone. Carver's jaw worked. We have a driver staged 4 blocks north. Waiting for extraction orders. Get him on the radio. Tell him to find Brock Serrano and tell him write this down. She waited until Carver had his phone out. Tell him South Trench. East wall. Runs 80 yards. Take it. Transformer at the end. Take that out first. Carver looked at her. Write it down, she said again. He wrote it down. The next 22 minutes were the longest of Tessa's life, and she'd had 30 years of material to compare against. She sat in front of the monitors, and she watched, and she didn't talk and didn't move, except to reach up once and tuck her hair behind her ear, because it had fallen forward and was catching in her eyelashes. Carver stood behind her and also didn't talk, and 2 other men drifted in and out of the doorway, and the building around them had gone very quiet in the particular way that places go quiet when everyone in them is waiting for the same thing. At the 47-minute mark after Roman had left, the lights in the warehouse complex went out. Tessa exhaled. On the north traffic camera, she could see movement. The vehicles that had been staged were suddenly moving differently, quick adjustments, the particular disorganized quality of a position being abandoned or disrupted rather than executed. The funnel had broken. She watched the south feed. In the ambient light of the surrounding streets, sodium orange, thin, reflected off wet concrete, she could see the shape of the drainage trench. She saw a movement in it. She gripped the edge of the desk with both hands and watched the greenwashed night vision feed that Carver had switched to on the monitor above the regular camera. The night vision was better, sharper. She could see figures moving in the trench, crouched, fast, and other figures above on the service road reacting to something that was happening inside the building. She saw Roman. She didn't know, definitively, that it was him. She couldn't read faces on a night vision feed from a city traffic camera at this distance. But she knew the movement. She'd watched him move every night for 23 days, and she knew the particular economy of the way he carried himself, the precise, no-wasted motion quality of it, and the figure moving along the south wall at the head of the trench had it. She watched him reach the end of the trench. She watched him come up. She watched the position near the parked SUV on the south, approach the one she'd been watching, the one where a figure had been directing the assault for the past 40 minutes, moving other people, coordinating. The particular behavior of someone who was running the operation rather than executing it. She understood, with a cold and certain clarity, that the figure by the SUV was Silas Merrick. She watched Roman reach firing distance. She watched the figure by the SUV go down. She said nothing. She just watched. Her hands were still on the edge of the desk, and she realized she'd been pressing hard enough that the edge had left marks across her palms. On the monitors, the pattern of movement changed the organized, directed quality of Silas's operation, deteriorating into the confused scatter of people who'd lost their coordinator. Carver, behind her, said something short and sharp to one of the men in the doorway, and she heard boots on concrete moving urgently away. Reinforcements going, following the route she'd identified. The monitors showed her the next 7 minutes in fragments movement, position changes, the gradual resolution of the exterior chaos into something that looked more like control. Roman's control. The vehicles on the north side retreating. The loading bay area becoming still. Then the monitors were showing her an exterior that was occupied but no longer active. The difference between a battle and an aftermath. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them, put them flat on the desk, breathed. Carver said, "From behind her, they're extracting the wounded." She didn't turn around. "Roman?" A pause. "We're waiting on confirmation." She pressed her hands harder against the desk. "Carver." "We're waiting on..." His radio crackled. She heard Brock's voice through it, compressed and static-edged, 3 words that she felt in her sternum rather than heard. "Bosses down." The medical team arrived at the facility 12 minutes later. Tessa had spent those 12 minutes doing something she couldn't entirely account for. Afterward, she'd been in the office, and then she'd been in the corridor, and at some point, she'd ended up near the facility's receiving bay, which was where the vehicles came in, and she was there when the door opened, and Brock came through first with blood on his jacket that was not his own. Roman was behind him, 2 men supporting him. He was conscious, his eyes were open and tracking, but the left leg of his pants was dark from the thigh, down, and there was something wrong with his right shoulder that she could see in the way he was being held. He looked at her when he came through the door. She looked at him. "Coffee," she said. He laughed, which seemed to cost him something significant, and then he said something she couldn't hear because the medical team was moving around him, and she stepped back to let them work. She stood against the wall of the receiving bay and watched them work on him, and she was careful, very careful, to feel each individual thing she was feeling in its correct sequence rather than all at once, because all at once would have been too much. Leg wound, shoulder wound. He was conscious, talking, making poor jokes about coffee. These were survivable things. She breathed. It was only when Brock came to stand beside her, maybe 10 minutes later, that she understood the shape of what she'd done tonight. Not fully, the full shape of it would take longer, but the outline of it. The trench, Brock said. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Roman, who was now sitting against the far wall, while the medic worked on his shoulder. "How did you see it?" "The camera angle," she said. "From above, you could see the whole right side of the building. Roman's people on the ground couldn't see it. They were at street level." "I know." Brock was quiet. "The transformer. I saw the vehicles." "The pattern. You read the pattern of the vehicles." "I read traffic patterns every night. It's the same thing, basically." Brock turned to look at her then. He had a face designed for concealment, flat, neutral, the face of someone who'd spent years not showing what they were thinking, but she could see something in it now. Not gratitude exactly. Something more serious than gratitude. The acknowledgement of a debt that wasn't the kind you paid with money. "You saved his life," Brock said. Tessa looked at Roman across the room. He'd caught her eye again. Through the medic, through the people moving between them, and held it for a moment with an expression that she would need time alone to fully examine. "He saved mine first," she said. "I'm just making sure we're even." Brock almost smiled. Not quite. The architecture of his face wasn't built for it. But close. The aftermath settled over the facility like weather. Silas's organization, Silas, without Silas, dissolved in the hours that followed with the particular speed of things that had been held together by a single point of pressure. Roman's people moved quickly, securing positions, reaching out to the captains who'd been neutral, addressing the ones who'd been quietly cooperative with Silas. Tessa understood this in fragments, overhearing Brock's phone conversations, watching Carver's expressions as he received and relayed information. By the time dawn made the windows gray, the organized threat was over. What remained was the damage assessment, which was what they were in the middle of when the thing Tessa had not anticipated happened. She was in the corridor outside the office when she heard the raised voice. Not shouting controlled, but only just, the voice of someone keeping their anger leashed through effort rather than ease. She didn't recognize it immediately. She moved toward the office doorway. Inside, Roman was in the chair she'd occupied earlier, his shoulder properly dressed now and his leg elevated on a second chair that someone had brought in for the purpose. He looked exhausted in a way that went past physical into something structural, like the exhaustion was load-bearing. Across from him, standing, was a man she hadn't seen before. Mid-50s, silver-haired, compact, with the kind of posture that came from years of expecting rooms to orient around him. He was wearing a dark coat that was too good for the facility and had clearly arrived in a hurry. It was still Wes, at the shoulders from outside. He was looking at Roman with an expression that was somewhere between fury and something more complicated. "You didn't tell me," the man said. "Marco, 6 months. You've known about Silas for 6 months." The man's voice dropped, which made it worse. "I've been sitting at that table with you for 6 months, Roman. Every meeting, every report. And you said nothing." "I said nothing because I didn't know who I could trust." "Including me." Roman held his gaze, including everyone. The silence between them was the specific silence of two people who'd known each other long enough for this particular kind of hurt to be possible. "I've been with your father since before you were born," the man said. 29 years. I helped build what you inherited. And you sat across from me every week and looked me in the eye. And kept you safe," Roman said. "Quiet, hard, if you'd known. And Silas's people had gotten to you if they'd suspected you knew you'd have been used against me or you'd be dead. I kept you out of it deliberately. That wasn't your decision to make. It was exactly my decision to make. It's the only decision I could make." Marco's jaw worked. And the girl. Tessa went very still in the doorway. Roman's expression didn't change, but something in him did. What about her? She was at the facility tonight. She was in this room looking at your surveillance equipment. She coordinated with Carver. She helped direct your extraction. Marco paused. "Who is she, Roman?" "She's under my protection." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting." Marco looked at him for a long moment. "You trust her?" "Yes." "You've known her how long?" "A month?" "It's not about length of time, Roman." Marco's voice changed then. Dropped the anger, picked up something quieter and more dangerous. "I need to tell you something." Roman waited. "I know who's been feeding Silas your movements," Marco said. The room temperature seemed to drop. Tessa saw Roman's hand tighten on the chair arm. "Carver," Roman said. Not a question. Not quite. The name of the conclusion he'd been working toward. No. Marco sat down across from him. Vitelli. The name landed in the room like something physical. Tessa didn't know the name, but she knew what it did to Roman's face, and that was enough. Roman was very still. "Dante Vitelli," Marco said. "He's been providing meeting locations, route schedules, personnel movements. For at least 4 months. A pause. Possibly since the beginning." Roman said nothing. His jaw was set, and his eyes were on the middle distance, and Tessa, watching from the doorway, saw something move across his face that she hadn't seen before, on him. Not fear, not anger, but something that sat beneath both of them. something that had to do with a specific kind of betrayal that couldn't be managed by competence or controlled by preparation. Dante Vitelli was one of the 4 men who'd known the location of the compromised meeting. She'd known that. Roman had told her that night. She now understood from the quality of the silence in the room, trusted Vitelli above the other 3. "How long have you known?" Roman said. His voice was completely flat. "I confirmed it tonight. I've suspected for 3 weeks. Marco held his gaze. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain, and because..." He stopped. "And because what?" "Because Dante's brother-in-law sits on the Eastern Council. And if I brought you a suspicion that turned out to be wrong, I'd have handed Silas the fracture he needed, without Silas having to do anything." Roman looked at him. "And now you're certain?" Carver pulled Vitelli's communication logs tonight while everything was active, and Vitelli thought no one was watching the internal systems. "The logs are clear." Marco put a folder on the desk, between them. 4 months of outgoing communications to a number registered to one of Silas's shell operations. Roman did not look at the folder. He looked at the far wall. Tessa had seen him tired. She'd seen him controlled. She'd seen him briefly, in the moments that cost him composure, edging toward something more unguarded. She had not seen him like this specific stillness that had nothing of control in it because it had gone past the point where control was relevant. This was the stillness of someone receiving information that rearranged the architecture of the past several months all at once. "Dante was in the hospital room," Roman said, "when my father died." Marco said nothing. He flew with me to the memorial. He helped me write the announcement to the captains. Roman's voice didn't waver. That was almost worse than if it had. He called me every week for the first 6 months to ask how I was managing. Roman, he knew everything. Roman finally looked at Marco. Everything. Every operation. Every relationship. Every vulnerability. He was there for all of it. His jaw tightened. Silas didn't build this from nothing. He built it on a foundation that Dante laid. The silence held. Tessa understood, standing in the doorway, what she was looking at. Not just a betrayal. The specific betrayal that undid every victory that had just been won because Silas was gone. Yes, but the pipeline Silas had used was still there, was still intact. Was a man who'd had 6 months of complete access and had used it to construct something that outlasted the man it had been built for. The question was what was left of it, what had been shared beyond Silas. What was in motion that Roman didn't know about? Marco, as though following the same logic, said, "We don't know what else Vitelli gave him. Or who else might have it now." Roman nodded once. The kind of nod that was not agreement, but acknowledgement. "Where is Vitelli now?" Roman said, "His apartment." "He doesn't know we know. Keep it that way." Roman picked up his phone. "Get me Carver. What are you going to do?" Roman looked at him. "What I should have done 3 months ago." He paused. "I'm going to find out exactly what was passed, and to whom. And then I'm going to dismantle every piece of it, one connection at a time, before whoever inherited Salsa's operation figures out that Silas is gone." Marco stared at him. "Roman, you're describing weeks of work. Minimum. You've been shot twice tonight. I need to know how deep it goes." Roman's voice had gone to that flat, operational tone she recognized from his phone calls. The tone that meant the personal part was over and the calculation had begun. "I'll sleep when it's done." Marco stood. He looked at Roman for a long moment, with the expression of a man who had watched someone he'd known since childhood become something he respected, and was afraid for an equal measure. "Your father would have burned the whole building down," Marco said. "I know." Roman looked at his hands. "I'm not my father." Marco picked up his coat. He paused at the door where Tessa was standing, and he saw her there, and looked at her with an unreadable expression for a long moment, and then moved past her without speaking. Tessa stood in the doorway. Roman looked at her. "How long were you there?" he said. "Long enough." He looked at the folder Marco had left. "Then you know." "Yes." She came into the room. She stood across from him. "Vitelli, yes." He had 4 months, yes. Roman's jaw worked. "Which means whatever I thought I fixed tonight isn't fixed," she said. "No." He looked at the far wall again. Silas was the symptom. Vitelli was the mechanism. and I have no way to know how many people he reached out to. How many of Silas's remaining connections have information they shouldn't have? How many of my own captains have been approached with things? Vitelli told them. He paused. How many of them said yes? Tessa sat down across from him. Not in the way she sat at the diner, not the posture of someone managing a space, but leaning forward, elbows on the desk, looking at him directly. Start with what you know, she said. What I know is that I have a man who's been feeding my operations to my enemies for 4 months, and I don't know what he told them or who else has it. Start smaller. The meeting tonight, the one that was watched. Vitelli knew the location, yes. Who else did that location go to? Specifically. Roman looked at her. Why? Because if you can trace each piece of information to who received it, you can build a map of the exposure. Not guess at it. Actually map it. She paused. And then you can see where it goes to ground. He was quiet for a moment. That's not how this is usually done. How is it usually done? Quickly, violently, with a great deal of assumption about who's guilty. And how well does that work? He looked at her for a long beat. Not well enough, apparently. She sat back. So start with the meeting location. Tell me who knew it, he told her. She listened. She asked questions, specific practical questions about timing and communication methods, and who had been physically present versus who had been told remotely, and Roman answered them. And somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just the quality of the exchange changing from a man explaining a problem to 2 people examining it together. It was 4 a.m. Roman had been shot twice and hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks. Tessa had been grabbed by a man in her diner and pulled through a kitchen and run down an alley and watched a battle on a surveillance monitor. She had helped end that battle. She understood, sitting in the facility office with the gray dawn beginning at the windows and Roman Vare's eyes on her face. What she had walked into and how far past the door she'd already gone. She was thinking about that, sitting with the specific weight of it, when Roman's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression changed in a way she'd come to recognize as significant, not the shut-down expression of a bad call, but something sharper. Something that sat between recognition and dread. He answered it. He said 2 words. Talk to me. What came through the phone, she could hear it as a voice, but not as words made him go very still. When he hung up, he sat for 3 seconds without speaking. What, she said. Vitelli, Roman said. His voice was wrong. Careful in a way that meant the information he was about to give her required careful delivery. Vitelli didn't just pass meeting locations. What did he pass? Roman looked at her. He passed your name, Roman said. And this address. Tessa heard the words. She processed them individually and then together. She felt the specific cold of it start at the back of her neck and move downward. How long ago, she said. The communication was sent at 11:30 tonight. Roman was already standing, already moving, before the warehouse, before any of this was resolved. So whoever received it has had 5 hours, Roman said, and he was already through the door calling for Carver, calling for Brock, his voice gone to that operational flatness. And Tessa was on her feet and moving because she understood the math, and the math said that 5 hours was enough time to plan something and position people and be ready to move at a location they knew contained a woman whose name they now. Tessa was on her feet and moving because she understood the math, and the math said that 5 hours was enough time to plan something and position people and be ready to move at a location they knew contained a woman whose name they now had and an address they now knew and a man who'd been shot twice and hadn't slept in 30 hours. She was through the office door 2 steps behind Roman. The corridor outside was already different. The quality of the air had changed that specific tightening that happened when a space full of trained people received information that required them to shift from managed readiness into active response. Carver was already on a radio. 2 men she didn't know by name were moving toward the facility's east entrance, with a speed that was controlled but absolute. Brock was coming from the opposite direction. He looked at Roman and Roman looked at him, and the exchange of information between them took approximately 1 second and 0 words. East perimeter, Brock said. How many? Carver's getting the feed now. Roman turned to the nearest monitor station, a desk against the corridor wall, with two screens showing exterior angles. He leaned over it. His right shoulder was bandaged under his shirt, and she could see the bandage pulling with the motion and knew it had to hurt, and watched him not register it at all. She came to stand beside him. She looked at the screens. The east perimeter camera showed the fence line and the approach road and the waterfront beyond it. In the pre-dawn gray, the road looked empty. "Switch to the thermal," Roman said. Carver reached past him and toggled the feed. The road was not empty. Thermal imaging turned body heat into white shapes against a cooler background. He clicked it and there were white shapes on the east approach road that had not been there 20 minutes ago. Tessa counted them before Roman did. She was already counting and got to 7 before the angle cut off. "7's on the east approach," she said. "More on the south," Carver said. He'd switched his own screen. "I'm getting movement along the fence line." "South and southeast." "How close to the fence?" 50 yards. "Moving slow." Brock said, "They're not here yet. They're staging." "Then we have maybe 4 minutes," Roman said. He straightened. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the rapid calculation she'd watched him do. Before, the assessment of variables and positions and options that he ran like code. "How many of our people are inside right now?" 11, Carver said. 8 are the extraction team that came back with you. 3 are facility staff. 2 of the extraction team are walking wounded. Armed, all of them. The facility exits. 3. East vehicle bay, north personnel door, west loading dock. Roman looked at the monitor. At the 7 thermal shapes on the east approach. They know about the east bay. That's the obvious exit. He paused. "West loading dock. What's the sight line from the south fence?" "Blocked," Carver said. "The storage structure on the west side cuts the sight line for about 40 yards. 40 yards of blind exit." Roman looked at Brock. "We move the walking wounded and non-combat staff through the west dock in the next 3 minutes. Small group, no headlights, along the waterfront service road north." He was already moving as he talked, pulling Carver by the arm toward the east corridor. "Everyone else holds positions. We do not let them choose the engagement point." Tessa was keeping pace with him. He looked at her sideways. "Go with the west group," he said. "No. Tessa, I was useful on the monitors before," she said. "I'm still useful on the monitors. You need eyes on those thermal feeds, and you need someone reading the pattern who isn't also managing the response." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her full in the face, and she could see, in the 5 seconds that followed, the argument he was constructing and the counter-argument he was simultaneously recognizing she would make to it, and the specific frustration of a man who knew he was going to lose a point before he'd made it. "Monitor station," he said. "You stay at the monitor station. You do not move from it unless Brock personally tells you to move. You understand?" "Yes. If this goes wrong..."
"It won't."
"Tessa." His voice cracked on her name. Just slightly. Just enough. "If it goes wrong, you run. You don't wait for me. You don't look for me. You go west through the loading dock and you run and you don't stop." She looked at him. She thought about arguing. She decided this was not the argument to win. "Okay," she said. He held her eyes for one more second. Then he was moving again, and she was moving to the monitor station, and the facility was reorganizing itself around the next 4 minutes with the efficiency of people who'd rehearsed for exactly this kind of contingency even. They'd never rehearsed this specific situation. She sat down at the monitor station. She pulled both screens toward her. She looked at the thermal feeds. The shapes on the east approach had moved. Closer now. Still staging. But the spread of them had changed. They were compressing, which was what you did before you moved from staging to assault. She'd watched enough of the warehouse footage to understand the difference. "They're tightening on the east," she said loud enough for Carver, who was 6 feet away. 15 seconds to 2 minutes before they move. "Copy that," Carver said into his radio. She switched the south feed. The figures along the south fence line were still moving slow. Too slow. She looked at the pattern of them, the spacing between shapes, the direction of movement, the way the thermal image showed them arranged. She'd been wrong about something. She leaned closer. The south group wasn't staging. They were already in position. The slow movement she'd been reading as approach was actually, she tracked it across the screen, was actually the movement of people who were already at the fence and were holding. Waiting. They were waiting for the East group to draw attention. Carver. She kept her voice level. The South group is already at the fence. They're not staging. They're holding at the wire, waiting for the East approach to move first. Carver was on the radio immediately. She heard him relaying it. How many on the South? Roman's voice came back through Carver's radio, compressed and static-edged. Carver looked at Tessa. She counted the thermal shapes again. 9, she said, maybe 10. The angle's partial. Copy, Roman's voice said. A pause of 3 seconds. Hold the west exit for 3 more minutes. Don't open it until the radio cracked. Static. And then nothing. Carver tried the frequency twice. Nothing came back. She looked at him. They're jamming again, he said. She looked at the monitors. East approach. 7 shapes now moving they'd started, which meant she'd been right about the timing and wrong about having 2 minutes. They were already inside the fence. South position 9 or 10 shapes. Still holding, waiting for the East breach to pull the response. West loading dock. No thermal coverage on that angle the camera was down. She could see the dead feed on the 3rd screen. No way to know if anyone had anticipated the blind exit. She thought about the 40 yards of blocked sightline. She thought about the way Silas's people had positioned vehicles to funnel Roman's men at the warehouse, the way a force that understood space used its geometry. She thought, if I knew about the west exit as a blind spot, someone else might know too. Is there anyone positioned to watch the west dock? She said. Carver was managing 3 radio channels simultaneously. He looked at her with the expression of someone who'd run out of bandwidth. I don't know, he said. Then I need you to find out right now, she said. Because if the west camera is down and someone took it down deliberately, they may already be on the west side of that structure. Carver's face changed. He got on a radio channel and talked fast. The response came back in 12 seconds. She watched his expression as he heard it. What? She said. West dock is compromised, Carver said. There are 2 people inside the west structure. Our man at the dock found them 30 seconds ago. He paused. He's down. The cold hit her chest again. The wounded the people who were supposed to go out the west. They haven't moved yet. She looked at the east feed. The 7 shapes were inside the fence now and moving toward the east vehicle bay. She looked at the south feed. Still holding. Still waiting. She looked at the blank west feed. The east breach is the distraction, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. The south group is the main assault. They're waiting for your people to commit to the east defense before they come over the fence. She looked at Carver. If you pull people to the east now, the south breach hits while we're repositioned, Carver said. Yes, and the west is already inside. Carver stared at the monitors. She watched him do the same math she'd done and arrive at the same answer, which was that the facility was being hit from 3 directions by people who understood its layout, who'd had 5 hours to plan, and who had specifically anticipated the defensive posture that Roman's people would naturally take. This was not an improvised response to Silas's death. This was something that had been ready, something that Vitelli had built the foundation for, piece by piece, over 4 months, precisely for the contingency that Silas was removed from the equation. Silas had been planning for his own failure. She got to her feet. Where is Roman right now? East Corridor, managing the Bay defense. I need you to get him a message. Not by radio. She was already moving. In person. Someone has to go. I'm not leaving this station. Then send someone else. Tell him the East breach is a diversion. Tell him the South is the main force, and they move the moment he commits east. And tell him, she stopped, thought. Tell him the West structure is already inside. He needs to hit West first, fast, before the South sees that he's rotated, and then come back around South before they read the movement. Carver stared at her. Tell him, she said, now. He sent a man running. The next 9 minutes were the closest thing to a controlled nightmare that Tessa had ever experienced. She stayed at the monitors. She watched the thermal feeds with the concentration of someone who understood that what she could see on these screens was the only advantage anyone in this building had over the people outside it. And she was the only person currently watching them, which meant the advantage lived or died with her attention. East feed, the seven-shape group had reached the vehicle bay door. She could see this particular cluster of bodies. That meant they were working the door, breaching it. She understood, though she'd never watched a door being breached before, and was translating the thermal shapes into action by logic, rather than experience. South feed, 9 shapes, still at the fence, still holding. She watched for the change, the moment the holding position shifted into movement. With the folks of someone watching a pot they needed to see boil. She counted seconds without meaning to. A habit from shifts when she was waiting for an order to be ready, and the kitchen was backed up, and the customer was already asking. 1,000, 2 1,000, 3, a sound from the east corridor. Not a shot, something heavier, structural, the sound of a reinforced door giving way under sustained force. And then, immediately after, the sound she'd been expecting and dreading, gunfire. Short bursts, not continuous. Controlled, both sides. Her hands were flat on the desk. She made herself keep looking at the south feed. Come on, she thought. Come on, move. Show me. 40 seconds after the east bay door came down, the south shapes moved. All of them, together. The fence was chain link, and they went over it, rather than through it, which was faster, and she counted as the shapes cleared 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 99 shapes moving toward the south wall of the facility with the speed of people who'd been waiting and were now released. She grabbed the radio Carver had left on the desk. She didn't know the channels. She tried the first one. Static, second static, third. A voice she didn't recognize. East Bay is holding. We've got South breach incoming, she said into the radio, loud and clear. 9 people over the south fence, moving now. They're 30 seconds from the south wall. Whoever is south 9 people, 30 seconds. A pause. Then Brock's voice, compressed and immediate, copy. South team, rotate, more static. The jamming was intermittent, cutting in and out as whatever they were using swept frequencies. She switched the east feed. The 7-shape group was inside the vehicle bay now. She could see the thermal images of Roman's people, engaging them, the specific chaos of bodies in close proximity. The way thermal imaging turned a fight into an abstract of white shapes colliding and separating. She couldn't identify Roman in it. She tried. She couldn't. She looked at the west feed. Still dark. The camera was still down. She stood up. She knew where the west structure was. She'd walked past it when they'd arrived a low storage building, maybe 30 yards long, between the main facility and the fence. The loading dock was on its south end. If 2 people were inside it, and the man Carver had sent to the dock was down, then those 2 people were somewhere between the dock and the facility's west entrance. And the wounded Romans walking wounded, the 2 men from the extraction team were still inside the facility, because the west exit had been blocked before they could move. She thought about a man with a bullet wound in his leg trying to fight his way out of a building. She thought about what happened to people who couldn't move fast, when fast was the only option. She went to the corridor. She didn't run. Running in a building where people were firing weapons in response to threats they were actively tracking was the kind of movement that got you shot by your own side. She moved fast and flat against the wall, and she kept her eyes ahead. She found the west corridor by following the facility's layout, as she'd memorized it from the maps on Carver's desks. She'd looked at them while she was at the monitor station, the layout of the place, because understanding the space had seemed important, and she'd been right about that. The west corridor was a long straight run with the loading dock door at the far end and 2 side rooms off it. The corridor was not empty. One of Roman's men, she'd seen him before, young, maybe 25, with a bandage around his left forearm from the warehouse, was on the floor near the first side room. Not dead. She could see the rise and fall of his chest. Unconscious. The loading dock door at the far end was closed. And between her and it, with his back to her, looking through the crack of the second side room door, was a man she didn't know. Dark jacket. something in his right hand that she didn't need daylight to identify by its shape. She stopped. She was 10 feet behind him. She thought with remarkable clarity given the circumstances about the kinds of decisions that got made in 10-foot corridors at 5 in the morning when you were a waitress who'd agreed to a stool and $500 a night and had somehow arrived here. She looked at the floor around her. Industrial concrete, metal shelving on the right wall. On the bottom shelf, at her height, a fire extinguisher in a red bracket. She looked at the man's back. She looked at the fire extinguisher. She took it off the bracket. It was heavier than she expected, 15 pounds, maybe more, and cold in her hands, and she held it with both hands, and she thought, don't think, just do. She crossed the 10 feet in 4 steps, and she brought the base of the extinguisher down on the back of the man's head with everything she had. The sound it made was something she would not think about later if she could avoid it. He went down. The weapon he'd been holding skittered across the concrete and hit the wall. She stood over him for 2 seconds, breathing hard through her nose, and then she moved to the loading dock door and pressed her back against the wall beside it and listened. From the other side, nothing. No movement, no voice. She thought about the second person Carver's man had found. One was on the floor behind her. One was unaccounted for. She pressed her ear closer to the door. A sound. Faint. The specific sound of someone trying to be quiet and not entirely succeeding a controlled exhale. The small shift of weight on concrete. Right outside the door, Tessa looked at the door handle. Looked at the extinguisher in her hands. Looked at the hinges the door opened inward toward her. She thought about what happened when a door opened toward someone who was standing right outside it. She grabbed the handle. She yanked it open hard fast. With everything she had, and the edge of the door caught the person on the other side full in the face, and she heard the impact, and heard the person go down, and then she was through the door, and outside, in the pre-dawn cold of the loading dock area with the extinguisher still in her hands. The person on the dock was down and staying down. She didn't look at them long. She looked at the space around her, the storage structure to her right, the fence beyond it, the main facility wall to her left, and she looked for movement and found none. She went back inside. She pulled the dock door shut. She looked at the man she'd hit with the extinguisher and confirmed he was breathing. He was, and she picked up the weapon he'd dropped, which was a handgun, and she held it the way she'd held the extinguisher, like a tool, with both hands, and pointed at the floor. She went back to the corridor. She found the second wounded man in the first side room, conscious, sitting against the wall with his hand pressed to his leg, and his face the color of old paper. He looked at her. He looked at the gun. He looked at the extinguisher she'd set down in the doorway. "Are you hurt worse than before?" she said. "No." His voice was thin. "Same. There were 2 people between you and the west exit. One is down at the second room. One is down at the dock." She paused. "Can you walk?" "Not fast." "Fast enough to get to the dock door?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah." She helped him up. They moved to the dock together, her with the gun and him with one hand on the wall and his other hand pressed to his leg, and she thought 20 yards. Just 20 yards. They made it. She got him outside and around the storage structure and to the section of fence that was blind from the south approach. She could see the south wall of the facility from here, and she could see, peripherally, that something was happening there, that Roman's people had met the south breach, and the sounds of it were the sounds of an active engagement, and she found the chain link gap that she'd spotted from the thermal feed angle, the place where the fence had been cut and pulled back, which was how the south group had come over, and which meant it was now an exit. She pushed the wounded man through it. She looked back at the facility. She thought about what Roman had said. "You run. You don't wait for me. You don't look for me." She looked at the gun in her hand. She looked at the south wall of the facility, where the engagement was happening, where Roman was. She went back through the fence. The south wall engagement was in the space between the facility's exterior and the storage structure, a corridor of open ground, maybe 20 feet wide. That had become the worst possible place to be because it offered nothing to hide behind, and the geometry of it channeled everything into a direct confrontation. She came around the south corner of the storage structure and stopped. Brock was there. 3 of Roman's men were there. 2 of Silas's people, she understood. They were Silas's from the position they were holding, backed against the facility wall with weapons up, were there. And Roman was there. He was standing in a position that told her immediately what had happened. He'd come from the East Bay engagement to the south, which meant the East breach had been handled, and he'd arrived at a standoff. The South group had gotten inside the outer perimeter, but hadn't gotten inside the building, and now they were in the gap between, and Roman's people had them contained, but not resolved. Because resolving it in a 20-foot wide space with concrete walls on both sides was an exercise in making sure both sides took damage. She saw him. She saw the set of his shoulders. She saw the way he was holding his right arm, slightly away from his body, which meant the shoulder wound was open again. She could see, even at this distance, and in this light, the wet dark of it through the shirt. She also saw, because she was watching the right place, the thing that nobody else was watching. The East Vehicle Bay door, the one that Silas's East group had breached. It had opened inward. It was still open. And through it, from the east, 2 of the shapes she'd counted on the thermal feed were moving. They hadn't been part of the Bay engagement. They'd held outside it. And now they were coming around the east corner of the facility, toward the south gap. Coming from behind Roman's position, she had the gun in her hand. She didn't think about what she was going to do. There wasn't time to think about what she was going to do. She raised the gun, the way she'd seen it done on the monitors, on the feeds. In every piece of pattern recognition she'd spent the last hour performing, and she pointed it at the East Bay door, and she said, not shouted, said, in the voice she used for customers who needed to hear her clearly above the noise of a full diner stop. Right there. Don't come through that door. Every head in the south gap turned towards her, including the 2 shapes in the East Bay doorway, who stopped. The tableau held for 3 seconds that were the longest. 3 seconds she experienced in a night that had already produced several candidates for that distinction. Then Brock moved. He covered the ground between his position and the bay door in 4 steps, and the 2 men in the doorway made the decision she'd been hoping they'd make, which was the decision that preserved the most options for them, which was to surrender those particular options entirely. Roman was looking at her. She was looking at him. The South engagement resolved in the 30 seconds that followed, not cleanly, not without cost, but resolved. The remaining members of the South group, recognizing the mathematics of their situation, with the East and their people accounted for, and the man they were looking at being his reputation, said he was. When it was over, when the sounds had stopped, and the space had reorganized itself into something that felt, tentatively, like an aftermath, Roman crossed the gap to her. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face. He looked at the gun in her hands. You came back, he said. His voice was raw, not angry. Something past anger. Something on the other side of it. You had company at the east door, she said. Someone had to say something. Tessa, you're bleeding again. She looked at his shoulder. The bandage is through, I know. He reached out and carefully took the gun from her hands. His fingers closed over hers for a moment before he took it. Held them for 1 extra second. I know. Behind him, Brock was organizing the aftermath with the efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up situations like this before and had a method. Roman's people were accounting for their own. The facility's exterior had gone quiet, in the way that spaces went quiet when the thing that had animated them was finished. The sun was beginning, somewhere beyond the horizon. The waterfront was gray and flat, and the first birds were doing something distant and indifferent above the water. Tessa looked at Roman's face. The exhaustion in it was complete now, not the maintained exhaustion she'd been watching for weeks, but the exhaustion of something that had run its full course and arrived at the end of itself. Over, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Vitelli. She could see him thinking about Vitelli, the thing that wasn't over, the thing that would take weeks to dismantle, the full accounting of what 4 months of betrayal had spread into the organization's body like something that needed to be carefully, methodically excised. The immediate part, he said, and the rest. The rest is work. He looked at her. Long, careful, ugly work, but work. Not, he gestured slightly at the south gap around them. Not this. She nodded. He put his hand on the side of her face. The same gesture as before. His right hand, the controlled one. She put her hand over it the same way she had before. You didn't run, he said. I told you I wouldn't. You told me you would. I lied. Something moved through his face. Something that started as exhaustion and became something warmer briefly before the exhaustion reasserted its claim. We need to get inside, he said. And get this, he gestured at his shoulder. Looked at again. Yes, she said, you do. He started moving toward the facility entrance. She walked beside him. Brock fell in on Roman's other side, and behind them the south gap was being managed, and the east bay was being secured, and the facility was reorganizing itself with the particular resilience of something that had been hit and was still standing. Tessa walked and felt the cold of the morning on her face, and the gun callus forming on her palm that she'd examine later, and the specific bone-deep tiredness that came from being afraid for a sustained period, and then not afraid anymore. She thought about Marlowe's, about the counter, and the coffee pot, and the 3 other customers who'd been there when Roman first walked in bleeding. She thought about the way she'd held the coffee pot over his arm, and the threat she'd made, and how completely she could not have imagined, standing in that diner at 3:14 on a Wednesday morning, that she would be here. She thought, I am not the same person who made that threat. She was not sure exactly who she was instead, but she was walking, and Roman was beside her, and the sun was coming, and the immediate part was over, and whatever came next was work. She had never been afraid of work. Ahead of them, the facility door opened from the inside, and the light from within spilled out into the gray morning, and Carver was standing in it with an expression that was the closest she'd seen on his face to something like relief. And Roman walked through the door, and she walked through it behind him, and the door. The door closed behind them, and the morning light was cut off, and the facility swallowed them back into its artificial brightness. And Tessa stood just inside the entrance and let herself, for the first time in approximately 6 hours, stop moving. Her legs were fine. Her hands were fine. Everything was technically functional, which everything was clinical attention of someone taking inventory of a storeroom after a difficult shift. The gun callus on her right palm, the bruise forming on her left forearm where she'd hit the doorframe in the dark corridor. The cold that had gotten into her feet through the waterproof boots somewhere in the last hour and was only now registering. She was fine. She stood against the wall just inside the entrance and breathed and watched Roman cross the facility floor toward the medical area and watched Brock follow him and watched Carver intercept both of them with a radio in one hand and an expression on. His face, that meant there was more to manage. There was always more to manage. The managing did not stop because the shooting had. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor with her back against it and her knees drawn up, and she put her hands on her knees and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was industrial, concrete and exposed ductwork and fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency just below the level of conscious annoyance. She stared at it and breathed and gave herself exactly 5 minutes to simply exist in the aftermath of the night before she had to become functional again. She counted the minutes. Old habit. You counted things when you worked graveyard shift because the night was too formless otherwise. You counted tables, covers, tickets, minutes until the first bus, minutes until sunrise. At 4 minutes and change, Roman sat down on the floor beside her. Not across from her, not in a chair someone had brought. On the floor with his back against the same wall, close enough that his shoulder was an inch from hers. His right arm was in a fresh bandage. She could smell the antiseptic, and someone had given him a jacket because his shirt was unsalvageable. He didn't say anything. Immediately, she didn't either. They sat against the wall of the facility in the fluorescent hum and the particular quiet that followed catastrophe, and outside, somewhere, the sun was finishing its arrival over a city that didn't know and didn't care what in its waterfront industrial district between midnight and dawn. Vitelli, Roman said. Not a question. Just placing the name in the air between them. Yes, she said, we have him. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means Carver's people collected him from his apartment 40 minutes ago. He's in a room on the east side of this building. Roman paused. He doesn't know yet what we know. He thinks he's here because of Silas, because of the warehouse. And you're going to tell him. I'm going to talk to him, yes. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the folder Marco had left on the desk, the 4 months of communication logs, the specific weight of what Vitelli had done, not just to Roman's operation, but to the people who'd been hurt or killed or endangered because of information that moved from Vitelli's hands to Silas's hands and then into the world as bullets, and broken windows and a knife wound she'd wrapped with a dish towel 23 days ago. What happens to him, she said. Roman was quiet for a moment. That depends on what he tells me. Roman. I'm not going to kill him, if that's what you're asking. He said it without inflection, just stating a position. I'm going to find out everything he gave them, everything he knows, every person Silas reached with it. And then I'm going to use that to finish dismantling what's left. A pause. Vitelli will not be in a position to cause further problems. But he'll be alive. She thought about whether she believed him. She decided she did. Not because he was incapable of the alternative. She was not naive about what Roman Vare was capable of. She'd watched it operate at close range for 23 nights and one catastrophic morning, but because she'd also watched him make distinctions. Careful, considered distinctions about when violence served a purpose and when it was just violence. His father, she suspected, had not made those distinctions. Roman had learned them himself, the hard way, and they'd cost him something to keep. Okay, she said. He looked at her. That's it, okay? What else do you want me to say? He was quiet for a moment. Most people would want to know more, want to weigh in, argue for something. I'm not most people. She looked at the ceiling. And it's not my call. You know that, I know that. She paused. You'll do what's right. You don't know that. I know you well enough. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at her already. Up close, in the fluorescent light, the exhaustion on his face was complete and architectural, embedded in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had recently learned that the thing was heavier than he'd thought. You're not your father. Something moved in his expression. Quiet and precise, like the click of something finding its place. Marco said that. Almost exactly. Marco's been watching you longer than I have. He probably sees it more clearly. He also withheld information for 3 weeks to protect his own position. Yes, she considered, people do that. Even people who mean well. Doesn't make the observation wrong. Roman looked at the floor between them. At his hands. The right one, which was controlled and deliberate and which had touched her face twice, now in the particular way, that meant something not tenderness exactly, not possession, but the specific touch of someone who was making a choice about what mattered to them. The left, which had been wrapped in a dish towel by a woman who'd threatened him with a coffee pot and had apparently decided, somewhere between that moment and this one, to become the most improbable person in his world. I need to talk to Vitelli, he said. I know, and then I need to sleep. Yes, she said, you do. And then he stopped. Started again. There are things that need to happen. Structural things. The organization, what's left of it, needs to be examined from the outside in. Everything Vitelli touched needs to be reviewed. The captains need to be addressed. Marco needs to be addressed. He paused. My father built something that ran on fear and proximity and the particular loyalty that comes from people knowing what you'll do if they betray you. I've been running it the same way because I didn't know another way. He stopped again. She waited. I need to know another way, he said. It was perhaps the most unguarded thing she'd heard him say. Not because it was vulnerable in a performed sense. Roman didn't perform vulnerability. It was one of the things she'd understood about him early. But because it was honest about a limit, and honest about a limit meant acknowledging the limit existed, which was the specific kind of admission that powerful people rarely made to anyone, let alone to a woman they'd met bleeding on a diner stool. That's going to take longer than one conversation, she said. I know, and it's going to require you to actually sleep occasionally. I know. More than 3 hours, Tessa. More than 4. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The possibility of one, tired and real. Go talk to Vitelli, she said. I'll be here. He got up. His shoulder gave him trouble with it. She saw the wince he controlled, and he was upright and moving before she could offer anything, which was typical of him, and no longer surprised her. He stopped after 3 steps, turned back. The diner, he said. She looked at him. Marlowe's, the window that was broken. The wall, the floor. He held her gaze. I'll have it taken care of today. You'll be able to open tomorrow night if you want to. She thought about Marlowe's, about the broken window, and the bullet hole in the wall and the blood on the floor that she'd have to clean again. Different blood this time, and the owner who'd been calling her phone since 4 a.m. because someone had reported the broken window to the building management. Okay, she said. Tessa. He paused. I'm sorry for what happened there. I know you are. It shouldn't have. Roman. She said his name with the specific flatness that stopped him. Go talk to Vitelli. We'll handle the rest later. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he turned and walked toward the east side of the building, and she watched him.
Oh yeah.
And she sat against the wall on the floor and closed her eyes for the first time in a very long time. The Vitelli conversation lasted 2 hours. Tessa knew this because she was awake for all of it, having failed entirely to sleep despite the exhaustion and the floor and the fluorescent hum. She'd moved from the wall to a chair at some point, and someone had brought her coffee, real coffee, better than Marlowe's, which she resented slightly on principle, and she'd drunk it and watched Carver manage the ongoing operational aftermath, and listened to the building gradually transition from crisis mode to something more sustained and grinding. She didn't know what was said in the room where Vitelli was. She didn't ask. What she observed was the quality of Roman's face when he came out of it 2 hours later, which was the face of a man who had received information he'd needed and had processed it without flinching, and was now carrying it the way he carried everything, with the deliberate, slightly crushing weight of someone who'd decided that carrying it was his job. He came to where she was sitting. He sat in the chair across from her. He looked at the cup of coffee she was holding. Give me that, he said. She gave it to him. He drank, made a face. It's cold, she said. I can see that. You were in there for 2 hours. Yes. He set the cup down. He laced his hands together and looked at them. 4 months. He gave them 4 months of operational data. Routes, schedules, personnel assignments, safe house locations. He paused. Meeting locations, the one that was watched, and 3 others I didn't know about. 3 times that Silas had information he should never have had, and I attributed it to better intelligence on his side. His jaw worked. It was mine, my own intelligence, handed over. What else? Names. People Silas reached out to with what Vitelli gave him. Some of them said yes. Some of them said no. He looked up. Marco was not one of the ones who said yes. I want you to know that. She nodded. 3 captains were. 2 of them are gone. They were at the warehouse last night on Silas's side. The 3rd is in the northeast and doesn't know yet that Silas is dead. He paused. He'll find out today. And then he'll have a choice to make. Roman's voice was flat. I'm going to give him the opportunity to make it correctly. She thought about the man who'd grabbed her uniform in Marlowe's, about the way Roman had crushed his wrist without raising his voice, about the difference between that and what was in Roman's eyes right now, which was not anger, not threat, but the specific determination of someone who'd decided to do something difficult the right way, because the wrong way was what his father would have done. What about the ones who said no? She said. The ones who refused Silas. Yes. Roman was quiet for a moment. I need to talk to them. Individually. Acknowledge that I know they were approached and they held their position. He paused. My father never did that. Never acknowledged loyalty directly. He expected it as the default and punished its absence. A beat. I'm going to do it differently. That's going to surprise some of them. Yes, it is, he almost smiled. Good, she looked at him. At the exhaustion and the damage and the particular quality of something that had been broken open and was tentatively letting something else in. Roman, she said, go sleep. There's still... Carver is managing it. Brock is managing it. Marco, presumably, is managing whatever Marco manages. She looked at him steadily. You have been awake for approximately 30 hours. You have been shot twice, and you have just spent 2 hours in a room with someone who spent 4 months betraying you. You need to sleep. He looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said. Before you ask. He hadn't been going to ask. She could see that. But she could also see what it did to his face. When she said it, the small, controlled release of something he'd been holding. There's a room on the north side, he said. Cot. It's not, I've slept on worse. He stood. She stood. They walked to the north side room together, and it was exactly what he'd said, a cot, a bare room. A small window that showed a gray strip of morning sky, and Roman sat on the edge of the cot, and she sat on the only chair, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The diner, he said. Not the apology this time. Something else. What about it? I want to buy it. She stared at him. The building, he said, and the lot beside it. Both are owned by a holding company that's been trying to sell for 18 months. He looked at his hands. I want to buy them, and I want to give them to you. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a sentence that required a moment to fully arrive. Roman, no laundering, no syndicate business. Clean title, clean transaction, your name on the deed. He looked at her. You've been working that counter for 7 years, and you've got nothing to show for it except someone else's register and shoes that leak in the snow. He stopped. You should own the ground under your feet. She thought about the 3 notices from her landlord, about the electric bill, about the paper towel folded into the sole of her old right shoe. She thought about what it meant for a man like Roman Veyer to offer something with no strings, no obligation, no leverage. She thought about whether that was what this was. She looked at his face and decided it was. I'd want to build it right, she said slowly. Not just fix Marlowe's. Actually build something. She thought about the overnight workers, the nurses and truckers and factory people, the ones who needed somewhere warm and decent at 3A. Real wages for the staff, security. A kitchen that actually works. Yes, I'd want to run it myself, my books, my decisions. Yes, no Roman Veyer money in the operation, clean. The building purchase would be a gift. After that, it's yours. Entirely. She looked at the gray strip of sky through the window. She thought about a space that smelled like good food, instead of old grease. About a counter that was hers. About staying open when other places closed. Because the people who needed somewhere to go at 3A. Didn't stop needing it just because it was inconvenient. Okay, she said. He exhaled, a long, slow release. She wasn't sure he'd realized he'd been holding it. Go to sleep, she said. He lay down on the cot. He was asleep in 4 minutes. She counted. She sat in the chair and watched the gray strip of sky lighten, and thought about all of it, the 23 days, the coffee pot, the dish towel and the expired antiseptic, the boots without a note, the space heater and the imported tea. The moment in this very facility when she'd kissed him because she'd decided that knowing the cost of something didn't mean you had to refuse it. She thought about Marlowe's broken window and the bullet in the wall and the blood she'd have to clean again. She thought about what she'd do with a kitchen that actually worked. She did not sleep, but she rested, which was close enough. Dante Vitelli, in the end, gave them everything. Not because he was brave, he wasn't, and not because he felt remorse exactly, though he performed something like it in the room with Roman that Roman did not mention to Tessa and she did not ask about. He gave them everything because he was a practical man who understood mathematics, and the mathematics of his situation were simple. Cooperation was the only variable he controlled, and it was the only one that affected the outcome in his favor. He gave them 4 months of communications, the names of the people Silas had approached, the 3 who had agreed, 2 dead and 1 in the Northeast, who received a visit from Marco that same afternoon, the 6 who had declined and said nothing, whom Roman would address individually in the weeks that followed. The shell accounts and the specific financial mechanisms Silas had used to compensate Vitelli, which gave Carver's people the ability to trace the money backward through several layers and arrive at 2 other operations that Silas had been quietly building that nobody had known existed. It took 3 weeks to fully dismantle. Tessa watched some of it and heard about the rest, because she was there at the facility, At a second location, Roman moved the operation to when the waterfront building was compromised. In conversations that she was sometimes included in and sometimes not, navigating the specific ambiguity of her position with the same pragmatic attention she'd applied to 7 years of navigating Marlowe's. She was not Roman's consigliere. She was not his enforcer or his strategist or any title that fit inside the structure of what he ran. She was the woman who could read a room the way other people read text, the pattern of it, the congestion points, the thing that was wrong before it announced itself, and who had, on several occasions now, used that skill in contexts that were considerably higher stakes than managing a dinner rush. She was also the woman he came to at the end of the day. Whatever the day had been, she thought about that a lot. About what it meant to be the person someone came to. About whether she was equipped for it, whether she wanted it, whether wanting it and being equipped for it were even the relevant questions. She decided they weren't. The relevant question was simpler. Was she going to run from something she'd chosen? She had a well-established position on running from things she'd chosen. The Northeast captain's name was Ferraro, and he came to a meeting in the 3rd week with the particular caution of a man who'd been given a choice he hadn't expected and was trying to determine if the choice was a trap. It wasn't a trap. Roman sat across from him in a room with Marco and Brock and told him, plainly, that he knew Silas had approached him, that he knew Ferraro had declined, that he was acknowledging that directly because it mattered and because his father wouldn't have done it and he was not his father. Ferraro was 61 years old and had operated in the Northeast for 22 years and had never once been acknowledged for a decision he'd made correctly. He sat across from Roman, and something moved through his face that was complicated and old and not entirely resolved. "What do you want from me?" Ferraro said. "What I've always wanted," Roman said. "What I should have been clearer about asking for from the beginning. Honesty. When something's wrong, you tell me before it's a crisis. When someone approaches you, you tell me before they approach someone else. That's it." Ferraro looked at him for a long moment. And in return, the same. Roman held his gaze. "I tell you what you need to know to do your job. I don't manage you by keeping you half-informed." He paused. "My father ran it that way. It almost destroyed everything he built." Ferraro was quiet. "You sound different than you did 6 months ago." "I've had an instructive few weeks. I heard there was a woman." Ferraro said it carefully, neutrally, testing the temperature of the statement. "There is," Roman said. "That's not your business." "No," Ferraro agreed. "It's not." He paused. "She's the one who was at the diner." "Yes, the one Vitelli named, yes." Ferraro looked at his hands. "At the table, at Roman. She read the surveillance feeds from the warehouse." "That's what I heard, among other things." Ferraro was quiet for a moment. "Your father would never have allowed a civilian into a facility like that." "My father's operational decisions left something to be desired," Roman said. "As the last 4 months have demonstrated." Ferraro almost smiled. It was a brief and weathered thing, the smile of a man who'd survived long enough to find certain truths funny, in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. "All right," Ferraro said. "All right, that was the conversation." 2 syllables, and a decision 22 years in the making, sitting in a room in the 3rd week of what would become a much longer process of rebuilding something into a shape it had never quite had. Roman told Tessa about it that night. She was in the facility's small kitchen. She'd commandeered it in the 2nd week because the coffee they were producing was genuinely unacceptable. And she was making a second shot when he came in and sat on the counter across from her, the way customers sat on stools, and told her about Ferraro. She listened. She poured the coffee. She handed him a mug. "He'll hold?" she said. "Yes." Roman drank. "He's been holding for 22 years. He just needed to be told it was noticed." She thought about that. About what it cost a person to do the right thing in difficult circumstances and have no one ever acknowledge it. About how long you could do that before you stopped. "You should have led with that," she said. "From the beginning." "The acknowledgement, I know." He looked at his coffee. "My father taught me that showing appreciation was showing vulnerability. That the organization ran on fear, not gratitude, because fear was reliable and gratitude was contingent." Was he right? He was right that fear is reliable. Roman set the mug down. He was wrong about what it costs. Fear works until it doesn't, and when it stops working, you have nothing underneath it. He paused. Gratitude takes longer to build, but it holds differently. She looked at him. That's the most human thing I've ever heard you say. He looked back at her. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation. She didn't quite laugh, but she almost did, which was close. Marlowe's was rebuilt in 6 weeks. Tessa was involved in every decision, which was what she'd asked for, and which turned out to be more work than she'd anticipated. Because decisions about construction and design, and permits and equipment and staffing were each individually manageable and collectively overwhelming. She managed them anyway, with the particular stubbornness of someone who'd been doing overwhelming things in manageable pieces for her entire adult life. She hired 4 people, paid them wages she'd calculated based on what she would have needed to feel financially stable, not comfortable, not rich, but stable. The particular dignity of knowing the number in your account could absorb a car repair or a medical bill without requiring a decision about which bill to defer. She provided overnight security through a firm she'd vetted herself, which Roman had helped her evaluate but had not chosen for her. She designed the layout of the counter herself, because she'd been working counters for 7 years and had opinions about sightlines and access and the specific ergonomics of a space where you were going to stand for 8 hours straight. She named it Rowan's Night Kitchen, not after Roman. After herself. Rowan was her last name, had always been her last name, and she'd been Tessa Rowan since before she was anything else. The name felt right. The name felt like something she'd earned. The night it opened, she stood behind the counter at 11 p. M. and looked at the space, the warm light she'd specified, the counter she'd designed, the kitchen behind it, that actually worked, and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness, exactly, because happiness implied an absence of complication, and there was plenty of complication still. But something solid, something that was hers in a way that nothing had been hers before. Roman came in at midnight. He sat on the stool she'd saved from the original Marlowe's. She'd kept one, deliberately, the same one he'd always used, because she was sentimental in ways she didn't always admit. He looked around the space. He looked at the counter. He looked at her. He didn't say anything immediately. She poured the coffee. He drank it, set the mug down. It's good, he said. The coffee or the space? Both. He looked around again. The light is better. Marlowe's had dying bulbs. I replaced them. The counter is higher. By 2 inches. Better for my back. He nodded. He looked at her. How does it feel? She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she'd ever answered him. Like something I built, she said. Not something I inherited or was given. Something I built. She paused. The building was a gift. The rest is mine. Yes, he said, it is. She moved away to check on the other customers. There were 7, a good number for the first night. A nurse and her colleague from the hospital 3 blocks east. A cab driver she recognized from Marlowe's, who'd shown up out of habit. A young man with a laptop who'd been there when she opened and showed no signs of leaving. She took orders and refilled coffees, and did the small, precise work of a well-run counter with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years and was doing it now in a space that amplified rather than diminished the doing of it. When she came back to Roman's end of the counter, he reached into his jacket. She watched him take out his wallet, watched him place $500 beneath the mug. She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked up $498. She pushed it back across the counter. Coffee is $2, she said. He looked at the $2 he owed, looked at the money she'd pushed back, looked at her face. He left the $2. He picked up the rest and put it back in his wallet without comment, which she appreciated, and drank his coffee, which she'd made exactly the way he took it, and sat with his back to no one, which she'd designed the counter specifically to allow for, because she'd known he would come and she'd known he would need it. The night moved around them. Customers came and went. Her cook, a woman named Doria, who was 53, and had worked in restaurant kitchens for 30 years, and had been underemployed for the last 4 of them, and who had looked at Tessa's offer, like it might be a trick, before deciding it wasn't. Sent 2 plates of food to the counter without being asked, because Daria had opinions about feeding people who looked like they needed feeding, and Roman, in Daria's assessment, qualified. Roman ate without argument, which told Tessa more about the state of his recovery than anything else had. Around 2 in the morning, when the rush had thinned and the counter held only Roman and the laptop young man, Tessa leaned against the back counter and looked at the space she'd built and thought about the trajectory from 3:14 M and Marlowe's to here. She thought about the coffee pot she'd held over Roman's arm, the threat she'd made in exhaustion and stubbornness, and the particular refusal of a person who'd been pushed too many times by too many people to be pushed one more time. She thought about what she'd been then, not a worse version of herself, not someone smaller or lesser, but someone whose world had been the size of the counter she stood behind, and the rent, notices on her table, and the 7 years of graveyard, shifts that had not given her anything except the particular competence of someone who'd been doing hard things without recognition for a very long time. She thought about what she was now. She was still the woman who'd held the coffee pot. That hadn't changed. The stubbornness hadn't changed, or the exhaustion, or the precise impatience with people who thought a threat would make her smaller. Those things were structural. They were her. What had changed was the size of the world she moved in, and the knowledge specific, earned, tested under conditions she could not have anticipated that she could move in it. That the skills she'd developed behind a counter, translated unexpectedly and completely to reading surveillance feeds and identifying drainage trenches and holding a fire extinguisher in a dark corridor and making the decision that needed to be made. She had not become someone else. She had become a larger version of herself. She wasn't sure there was a distinction, but it felt important to name. Roman looked up from his coffee. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks now, with the particular attention of someone who'd decided something and was at peace with the decision in a way that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with choice. He was not certain about Tessa. He was not certain the future would be manageable, or that organization would fully resolve, or that the process of transforming what his father had built into something he could live with would go the way he intended. He was certain about the choice. That was different. Late crowd tonight, he said. It'll pick up around 3. The hospital shift change. You know the pattern already. I've been working night shifts for 7 years. I know every pattern. She looked at him. You look better than you did 3 weeks ago. I've slept. More than 4 hours? Occasionally. Roman. 6. He said it with the particular tone of someone conceding a point. 6 hours, 3 times this week. That's almost respectable. Don't push it. She almost smiled. He almost smiled. The space between them held the particular warmth of 2 people who'd been through something real together and were still standing on the other side of it, which was not a small thing, and both of them knew it. The captain, she said. Ferraro and the others. How's it going? Slowly. He turned the mug slightly. Better than I expected. Worse than I'd like. He paused. Marco thinks I'm being too patient. What do you think? I think my father's version of impatience built the mess I've been cleaning up for 3 weeks. He looked at his hands. Slow is better, even when slow is uncomfortable. That's growth, she said. Don't patronize me. I'm not patronizing you. I'm observing. She picked up the coffee pot. You want more? He pushed the mug toward her. She refilled it. They stayed like that for another hour, her working the counter, him at his stool, the night moving around them in its particular rhythm of need and provision. The nurses and the cab drivers and the insomniac young man with his laptop who finally packed up around 3 and nodded at her on the way out with the specific gratitude of someone who'd needed somewhere to be and had found it. At 4 in the morning, Tessa turned the lights over the counter down by half, the way she'd decided she'd do it in the last hour before close, because the quality of light at 4 a.m. wanted to be different from the quality of light at midnight. She'd been in enough 4 a.m.s to know this. Roman looked up at the change in light. He looked at the counter, at her. I should go, he said. Probably. He didn't move immediately. He sat with his hands around the mug and looked at the space she'd built and at her in it, and she looked back at him, and outside the city was doing what it always did at 4A. The particular suspended quality of it, the pause between the end of one day and the insistence of the next. This is a good place, he said. Not about the building. About more than the building. Yes, she said. It is. He stood. He put his jacket on carefully, accommodating the shoulder that would take another month to stop giving him trouble. He looked at her one more time. Tomorrow night, he said. I'll be here, she said. He walked to the door. The bell above it rang. She'd kept the bell, the same small bell that had rung over Marlowe's door for as long as she'd worked there, transferred to the new frame because some things were worth keeping. He went out, into the city, into the cold and the dark, and the particular complexity of the life he was rebuilding into a shape that could hold something besides itself. Tessa stood behind her counter. She picked up the $2 he'd left. She put them in the register. She closed the register. She began to clean up for close the same motions she'd made at Marlowe's for 7 years, the same wiping and stacking and accounting for the night, except in a space that was hers, with a counter she'd specified and lights she'd chosen, and a kitchen behind her where Daria was already done and gone, and the equipment was clean and functional and real. The city outside was cold and had no opinion about Tessa Rowan, or what she'd done with the 7 years before this night, or the one night in the middle of all of it when she'd held a coffee pot over a man's arm and refused, on exhaustion and stubbornness alone, to be made smaller than she was. The city didn't know. The city didn't care. Inside, the light was warm. She closed up at 5. She turned off the lights one bank at a time, moving from the back of the space to the front, the way she always had, the way she probably always would. She put on her coat. She locked the door. She stood on the sidewalk outside Rowan's night kitchen for a moment and looked at the dark windows and the sign her name, in clean letters, backlit and visible from the corner, and breathed the cold air and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who had stood their ground in a doorway and refused to move and had, eventually, found out what was on the other side of it. She walked home in the dark. The boots held on the wet pavement, solid and waterproof, every step.